Chapter 625. It was another long paragraph, with the tone of an early Schiller script. Su Lu vaguely understood what this relative of his was trying to convey. Due to the vast relationship between them that spanned across the Federation and the Empire, this imperial master was willing to help him, but he was not willing to put too much effort into it. In other words, he did not have many good methods to deal with the wrath of the imperial family. This paragraph also mentioned some things that happened decades ago. The great teacher had clearly wrongly attributed Su Li's ability to escape the surveillance of the imperial chip to the small blue device, not knowing that he had the ability to extract the chip from the back of his neck. What Su Lu was thinking more about was that if the little blue device was the uncle's invention, then the image of the former master's pocket emitting blue light as he traveled around the Federation in her mind, was naturally not real. It seemed that imagination was not the truth of history after all. If you are willing to help me leave the Empire, I will be very grateful. He slightly raised his chin, unwilling to look at the middle-aged man's naked legs. After a moment of silence, he continued, I don't have a complete understanding of the things that happened back then, but I believe that since your father could enter the Federation on a spaceship alone, he must have a very impressive spaceship. That spaceship is indeed very impressive. The great teacher lifted his thin shirt and scratched his smooth thighs in an indecent manner. Then he lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. But I don't know where it is. Besides, although the universe is vast, who knows how many imperial warships are hidden in it? How did you get out? Su Lu was silent again, guessing how much of what the great teacher said was true. He tightened his grip on the gun and then loosened it. Lowering his head, he said, that star map. The great teacher blew out a mouthful of light blue smoke and frowned his good-looking eyebrows. He said self-deprecatingly, if I had a spaceship and a star map, I would have run to the Federation to play by myself. Do you know what a star map is? The middle-aged man's inhumanly handsome face suddenly flashed with a hint of emotion. He held the cigarette in his mouth and gently exhaled the words with the smoke. Li Pifu might know a little, but he doesn't know where the star map is. Our Majesty, Student Hui Fu Cha, knows where the star map is hidden, but until today, he does not know the true contents of the star map. As for the other big shots in the Imperium and the Federation, they know nothing at all. In the entire universe, only I know what that star map is, and only I know where it is. Master Fan held the cigarette between his index and middle finger and gently brushed his lush white hair. The smoke entered his hair and lingered for a long time before slowly dissipating. It was like a nebula in the sky, showing a sense of vicissitudes at an unbearably slow speed. Su Lu was still silently holding the pistol, aiming at his head. He listened quietly and didn't say anything unnecessary. He played the role of a quiet listener very well. Because the star map originally belonged to our family. The slightly mocking smile on the master's face gradually disappeared, and he said in a low voice, it passed from my father's hands to my sister's hands, and your father, Nasri, sent the bracelet back to my niece. It can be considered to have returned to the hands of our family. Su Li's eyes slightly froze. He remembered the bracelet he saw on Jian Shui'er's jade wrist. The bracelet was engraved with ancient letters and lyrics. He was shocked to find that the important star map, which had never appeared in historical records and was only silently sought by big shots at the level of military god Li Pifu and Lady Tai, had always been in Jian Shui'er's hands. But there was something wrong with this matter. If the bracelet that hid the star map was passed down by Master Fan of the Imperium, why was it engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? After hesitating for a moment, he raised his question to the beautiful middle-aged man in the smoke. Why is the ancestral bracelet of Master Fan of the Imperium engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? The great teacher laughed cheerfully. The air he exhaled dispersed the smoke in front of him. The thin coat on his body fluttered uneasily. He raised his leg and stepped on the stool beside him. He praised himself and said, this is also what I have always wanted to prove. Master Fan stared into Su Li's eyes and said with a charming smile, at the very beginning, there was no Federation, and there was no Imperium. Both sides came from the same place in the universe, and I have to narcissistically come to a conclusion that our family should occupy a very important place in this period of history. The inference was not complicated, and the conclusion was not narcissistic. Instead, it was very logical. However, there was no shock on Su Li's face. Instead, there was some indifference. He shook his head and said, "Many historians in the Federation are doing research in this area, but in front of the flames of war, this kind of experiment is not very meaningful. Because my ground is higher, the Imperium has to believe what I say," the great teacher said calmly. Su Li silently agreed with the great teacher's statement. There is a great calamity in the history of the Federation, but what is a great calamity? Have you ever dug up a prehistoric relic underground? Master Fan waved his arm and said disdainfully, "Only you poor mechanical citizens brainwashed by broken computers would not conduct in-depth research on these matters." What do you mean by not very meaningful? I have evidence to prove that both sides are relatives. That is enough. The Federation's current research also believes that the Great Calamity is a disaster for the prehistoric civilization. This point coincides with your thoughts. Su Li looked at the excited great teacher and said with a shrug, "All right, the Imperium might be a branch of that prehistoric civilization, and our families might be relatives. But where is your evidence? Is the bracelet on my beautiful niece's wrist not evidence? First, you have to show evidence that she is your niece. Look at this face of mine." Master Fan raised his head and forced his face, which could be described as peerlessly beautiful, to come before Su Li's face. Think about Jian Shui'er's face. Where can you find such excellent genes? That does make some sense, Su Li said with a shrug again, but don't forget that your princess is not very beautiful. There is still a lot of evidence and numerical units. How can there be the same astronomical units and dating methods that are so outrageous in different universes? Be it the Federation or the Imperium, as long as the big shots in power are willing, they can start a comparison work that involves all aspects of human society, Master Fan said sarcastically. Master Fan said mockingly, "It's a pity that what should have been the warmest and most exciting reunion in the history of mankind was directly turned into countless massacres by those greedy mineral merchants of the Federation." The middle-aged man opposite him looked like a licentious playboy, but after all, he was the most mysterious and honorable great teacher in the Imperium. Whether it was his psychological inclination or his position, of course, he was on the Imperium's side. Su Li had no intention of refuting his ridicule. Why am I so interested in Schiller? Not only because his popular novels in the middle period of his life seem to me to be the best way for humans to pass the time and survive the hardships of life, but also because I feel that from his works, I can clearly see the similarities between the Imperium and the Federation. There is no one in this world, no one with a brain that can come up with so many plots that require different life experiences, insights, and even extreme insights to write. According to my request, the Imperial Intelligence Agency collected a large amount of Schiller's works. The more I read, the more I feel that the person who can write so many scripts and novels can't be the same person. Su Li listened to him in silence, feeling a little strange. Regarding this question that had troubled the Federation's Literature Research Institute and the folk celebrity gossip fans for countless years, he suddenly thought of something. Could it be that Schiller really did not exist, and was not a sock puppet of one of the five, but, was it written by an old thing? Schiller is not the same person. Great Teacher Fan raised his head slightly, his gaze passing through the smoke and the black cloth to look at the white courtyard outside, the green trees, and the high sky. Or rather, those books were not written by the same person. He was just a narrator. Su Li was still silent. He originally thought that tonight's visit to the Great Teacher Fan Manor was ridiculous, but after the conversation, he realized that the owner of this white courtyard was indeed not an ordinary person. Shouldn't you put down your gun? Although we are not related by blood, you still have to call me uncle. The great teacher suddenly changed the topic. What kind of uncle is this? Su Li thought silently in his heart. However, in the Imperium, it was not a bad thing to have such an influential uncle. His father, who had died in a mining accident, seemed to have benefited him greatly. He only hoped that his mother and sister in the underworld would not mind that he had randomly recognized a relative. He put down his gun. This makes me feel much better. I can continue talking about my research over the years. Great Teacher Fan looked at him with an amiable smile and said, "My hobby since childhood has been literature. After obtaining 6 bachelor's degrees from the Imperial University, I finally chose to focus my life on comparative literature research. Comparative literature research between the Federation and the Empire. Yes, I am the only one in this department. From the head of the department to the lecturers to the students, I am the only one. I believe that in the entire universe, I am the only one in this field. It is absolutely unique." The middle-aged man smiled very proudly. Every generation's great teacher was a stunning talent, a figure who was close to a god in their own field. Sulu had long acknowledged this fact, but he really did not expect that this generation's great teacher Fan seemed to be a youth, a middle-aged man, or perhaps an old man who was intoxicated by literature. I have written countless unpublished papers to prove that Schiller's novel scripts have many texts that are too similar to each other. In the form of folklore, they are circulated within the Imperium. To prove that 2 societies came from the same civilization, what kind of similarity is the most important? That is the similarity of cultures. Great Teacher Fan pursed his lips and raised both of his hands as he spoke loudly. His thin jacket slid down his arms and piled up to his shoulders. Paired with his bare legs, he looked like a fanatical religious priest. According to the distant and almost blurred legends, although my ancestor was the biggest war oligarch, he was also the person who hated war the most. I am also the same. My hobby is literature, peace and love. So please allow me to temporarily imprison you in the name of literature, peace and love, the most precious things in my life." As his voice fell, the gradually dissipating smoke dissipated even faster. Su Li's pupils suddenly constricted. His right hand that was still holding the gun vigilantly was just about to raise when several thick bolts of blue lightning broke through the smoke and struck his chest fiercely. Chapter 626. The electric arc struck Su Li's chest, and the powerful impact instantly caused his knees to soften, causing him to fall to the ground. At the same time, an irresistible numbness surged and occupied every muscle fiber in his body, causing his body to tremble violently. He could no longer raise his right arm that was holding the gun, and the index finger that was pressing on the trigger was twitching violently. A crisp gunshot rang out, instantly breaking the silence of the night sky of the Great Master Fan Manor. At the same time, the pistol fell to the ground powerlessly. If it were the old Sulu, he definitely wouldn't have any ability to move after being struck by such a powerful electric current. However, at the cost of his meridians shattering and using death as a bet, Sulu forcefully recovered the true chi in his body. Su Li's realm had received some kind of strong increase, faintly entering into another realm. He didn't completely collapse. His knee heavily smashed onto the stone floor, creating a shattering sound that would make one's heart tremble. It was unknown whether it was the stone or the knee that had shattered. Su Li's suddenly bright eyes were filled with disbelief and anger. A scorching current surged violently behind his waist, resisting the invasion of the electric current with great difficulty. It was almost impossible for him to raise his right arm and point his finger at the great teacher's beautiful face that was filled with boundless excitement. There was still half a meter between his finger and that face, and there was only air between them. However, the great teacher's pupils suddenly shrank, and he squeezed out a scream of panic from his lips. With a kick of his feet, his entire body flipped over in an extremely sorry state. With a chi sound, an invisible force shot out from Su Li's fingertip, slicing through the air and arriving before the great teacher in an instant. The sharp force cut through the thin coat that was fluttering in the air. The great teacher, who was crying out in a strange manner, staggered and fell to the ground. His right hand drew a strange arc in the air and formed a hollow shield in front of his body. With a muffled bang, the hollow fist seemed to have grasped an invisible force, shattering upon contact, causing a few wisps of smoke and dust to fly up from nowhere. The electric arcs that shot out from the walls of the room continued to attack Su Li's body. He looked at the other party with grief and indignation, and his body trembled violently a few times before finally falling heavily to the ground, unable to get up again. Master Fan slowly opened his right hand and looked at the edge of his palm that had been shocked red with a pale face. He had not expected that Su Lu, who had been hit by several military electric currents, would still have the ability to fight back. With lingering fear, he silently sighed with emotion. The bloodline that his father had excavated in the Federation back then did indeed have incomparably strong genes. He lowered his head and looked at the tear in his clothes. He couldn't help but pat his chest to comfort himself. Then, he lifted the lower edge of his wide and thin coat with both hands. His bare thighs bounced up in a dazzling manner, breaking through who knows how many layers of black cloth in front of him. He rushed into the white courtyard and shouted, "Everyone come out. The first thing is done. The next thing is tomorrow. Remember to double the thickness of the steel plate." The white-haired housekeeper walked out of the darkness with a frown on his face. He bowed and said, "Master, although the palace is used to your running amok, isn't this a bit too big of a commotion? Also, will we, the ones who do the actual work, be hanged? With me around, who dares to touch you?" Master Fan tugged at the hem of his thin coat and said proudly, "Remember, you are participating in the occurrence of a major historical event." "Fine." The old housekeeper raised his hands helplessly. Thinking of his master's earlier orders, he said awkwardly, "The alloy prison cell has been prepared for a long time. There is no need to temporarily thicken the steel plate, right? If it is any thicker, then it won't look like a room anymore. It will look like a large piece of metal." Master Fan sighed and turned his head to look at Su Lu, who was being dragged out by the servants. He looked at the unconscious youth's face full of anger and unwillingness. He smiled bitterly and said, "The young people these days are much more powerful than our generation. If we don't double the thickness, I won't be able to feel at ease." "Why?" Su Lu rubbed his red and swollen palm and glanced angrily at the alloy wall with faint palm marks. He confirmed that with his own strength, there was no way he could destroy this room. Who knew how much alloy that evil and sinister fellow had used to create such a thick wall? For literature, peace, and love. The great teacher's voice rang out, sounding particularly righteous. "You can stay here in peace until the end of the war. That would be for the best." "Why?" he shouted in grief and indignation. After confirming that the great teacher did not seem to want to kill him or hand him over to the empire's royal family, Su Lu became more and more confused. They had just been reuniting with each other, discussing their relationship and thinking of a way to leave the empire. Why did the great teacher suddenly turn hostile and lock him up? "Don't worry, I'm not a schemer. The reason why I could guess that you would come and have a way to imprison you is because I've read too many books. I know that the Federation has a saying with the same meaning, there is nothing new under the sun. I've read too many books, experienced countless lives, and experienced countless complicated stories. So I can guess what you want to do. I also know what you should do." After a moment of silence, the great teacher smiled and said, "Everyone has their own historical mission. Student Su Lu, have you ever thought about what your historical mission is?" The words were very calm, but when they landed in Su Li's ears, he felt that the great teacher's voice had a hint of frenzy and excitement. He looked helplessly at the alloy walls around him. It was futile. The Empire's control of planet Tianjing continued. Any family that dared to violate the ban and allow flying vehicles to enter the atmosphere would face the most vicious attacks. The outer space of the planet was filled with the silhouettes of battleships. Countless battleships were withdrawn from various star regions and distributed to a few large space bases in the star system. Huai Chaosher walked on the grassy path of the Imperial Palace. She raised her head and narrowed her eyes to look at the clear and white sky. It was early in the morning,
and the heat of late spring and early summer had yet to arrive. The air was extremely cool, but her mood was not like that. The Federation's fleet had already entered the Empire's star region. Although they were still extremely far away from planet Tianjing, although the Federation had never attacked planet Tianjing, although the Emperor had already drafted the strategic plan of exchanging space for time, as the successor of the Empire and the god in the hearts of the soldiers, a heavy sense of responsibility and urgent anxiety had already pressed down on her shoulders. Her personal battleship had already been prepared for an expedition. Tonight, she would embark on a space journey to the battlefield. However, a few months had already passed, and that person had still not been caught. This was like a thorn that pierced deeply into her heart, casting a layer of strange and indescribable color on this unknown expedition. Your Highness, according to your wise instructions, tens of thousands of colleagues from 4 departments have worked tirelessly to investigate the mechanical equipment and household electronic devices that have appeared in the market in the past few months. Finally, we found a few target devices. These devices all have some modifications that do not conform to the common electronic standards of the Empire. One of them is a pirated video player that is currently selling like hotcakes. Hui Chaoshi walked out of the underground palace expressionlessly. Listening to the report of this subordinate of the intelligence bureau beside her, she knew that this fellow was probably not used to pleasing nobles. She did not care about the detestable parts of his words and only listened attentively. Check it out. After saying this, she sat in the military vehicle and thought silently for a long time. Suddenly, she opened her mouth and asked, "What time is it in Rio?" 9 o'clock. It's almost time. It was extremely rare for Hui Chaoshi to frown slightly, revealing a troubled and even slightly fearful expression. Su Lu was on the run in the Empire alone, and could actually escape for several months at a time. The chip monitoring system that covered all the streets and alleys could not find a trace of him at all. Hui Chaoshi directly deduced that Su Lu was able to do this without a doubt because of that amazing Nasri. And to know how Nasri did all this back then, there was probably only one place in the entire universe that could give the answer, and that was Master Fan Manor. However, Hui Chaoshi did not want to go to Master Fan Manor. Although the beautiful and almost demonic old man inside was her closest uncle, she still did not want to go. In this universe, the only one Hui Chaoshi respected was her father, and the only one she was willing to admit as her opponent was the Federation's war god Li Pifu. However, the only one she was wary of and even a little fearful of was that Master Fan uncle.
This was because she thought that this uncle was sick, very sick, the kind that read too many books and often did not act according to common sense. He was so crazy that it made people scratch their heads in confusion. Not to mention the relationship between generations, the Baijin royal family had always worshipped Master Fan Manor as some kind of transcendental existence according to the blood oath of the distant past. Towards Master Fan's madness, she could not hit or scold him, so, she could only be wary and fearful, and had the impulse to avoid him at all costs. However, she had to leave at night, and she would not be satisfied if she did not catch Su Lu, so she could only muster up her courage and enter that white courtyard. Master Fan Manor. Hui Chaoshi sat by the table, holding a teacup and sipping small mouthfuls. Her eyes scanned the surroundings vigilantly, worried that she would see her uncle run naked into the rain and shout for joy again. Fortunately, it was not raining today, but on that sunny day 10 years ago, he seemed to have run naked once. She furrowed her brows and suddenly turned around. Her short hair fluttered and a cold and ruthless expression suddenly appeared in her eyes. The heavy alloy door closed silently behind her, and the room was now a prison cell. "Uncle, what are you up to again?" Hui Chaoshi suppressed her anger and slammed the teacup on the table. She shouted at the surveillance equipment installed somewhere, "I am going to war tonight, and I do not want to be forced to listen to some Schiller script test by you." After a long silence, the great teacher's complacent laughter came from outside the room. "My dear niece, I did not expect that imprisoning you would be so much easier than catching Su Lu." "You caught Su Lu?" Hui Chaoshi frowned. "But why do you want to imprison me?" Chapter 627. What are you up to now? White Xiaoshi's brows furrowed tightly as she listened to the voice that came from somewhere in the dark room. She was at a loss as she forced out a cold voice from between her teeth. Her Highness, who had always been calm, confident, and proud, did not notice that she had repeated two meaningless sentences in such a short amount of time. Master Fan, who was standing outside the room with his thighs bared and proud of himself, ignored her and left while humming a tune. She did not know where he went. Huai Chaoshi felt as if a bullet had been fired, but it had landed on a pile of mindless cow dung. Her expression became extremely ugly, and after a moment of silence, she walked towards the wall on her left. She took a deep breath, and the thin body under her military uniform trembled slightly. With a light snort, she slammed her arm into the wall like a heavy hammer. Smoke and dust rose, and the dust fell, revealing the cold and threatening alloy inner wall and the faint imprint of a palm. Huai Chaoshi frowned as she looked at the wall in shock. She gently rubbed her wrist and wondered how thick the wall was built by the madman. She had hit it with all her might, but it did not break the wall. The building did not even tremble. She was about to embark on the journey to resist the Federal Army at night. She did not have the time to wait for that madman to calm down. In fact, in this absurd predicament and the fact that she was imprisoned on Tianjing, Her Highness had forgotten how to write the word calm. The heavy dust remover easily lifted her slender wrist and slammed her against the door. She grabbed the hard modern-style metal flower stand and violently smashed it against the wall again and again. The entire room was filled with flying debris like a hail of bullets and terrifying loud noises that rang out from time to time. Master Fan was lying on a chair in the white courtyard outside the specially made prison room. His bare thighs were spread wide open as he drooled over the armrest. He held a teapot in his hand as he listened to the sounds coming from the room and looked at the smoke and dust coming out from the alloy wall. He said angrily, "Did you see that? I told you that the young people nowadays are too vigorous and too beastly. I told you to double the thickness, but you didn't believe me. If the alloy thickness is still the original plan, not to mention my niece, this terrifying female monster, I'm afraid that even Sulu won't be able to contain her. But it's not a good idea to keep smashing it like this. Firstly, it feels a little dangerous. Secondly, such a loud noise will attract some people's attention," the white-haired old butler said respectfully. "That's true." Master Fan retracted his leg and thought for a moment. He put down his teacup, lit a cigarette, and said leisurely, "Turn on the high voltage for me. Also, tell the people inside to avoid any accidents." In the gloomy room, Huai Chaoshi was still silently throwing a tantrum. All the objects in the room that could cause damage to the walls had all become weapons in her hands. She valiantly slammed them against the alloy wall. Then, like waves crashing against a black reef, they turned into white foam and scattered everywhere. Just as she was about to grab the last set of pear-wood table and chair in the room, a tired and helpless voice suddenly sounded from the dark corner of the room. "Don't smash it. According to my judgment, we may have to rely on this set of table and chair to eat prisoners' meals for a few days." Huai Xiaoshi's fingers that touched the surface of the smooth wooden table slightly stiffened. She narrowed her eyes and looked over. Looking at the guy squatting in the corner like a distressed beggar, she remembered that Master Fan had said that he had caught this person. The room was very quiet. Sulu slowly stood up along the wall. His face was a little haggard, and his dyed brown hair was a little withered yellow. He looked like he had just recovered from a serious illness, but also like he had been starved for countless days. For some reason, seeing that the other person was also inexplicably imprisoned here, White Xiaoshi's mood calmed down a lot. She felt a lot more balanced, and her narrowed eyes gradually relaxed. The two of them didn't speak. They silently looked at each other in the room for a long time. The pursuer and the one being chased on the road of escape had to accept the fact that they were now both prisoners, and locked up together. "Hello." Sulu was the first to break the silence, forcing a smile. Huai Chaoshi lowered her chin slightly and replied, "Hello, long time no see." It was a very simple, calm, and even plain greeting between two people in this kind of relationship. However, it was precisely because they were people with such temperaments that the absurdity was actually natural. Outside the prison, someone informed them that the wall had been connected to high-voltage electricity and asked His Highness and Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu to pay attention to their personal safety. After that, there was no more sound. Using a floating hair that was burned to ashes, Wai Chaoshi confirmed that Master Fan Manor wasn't lying. She stopped her actions of destroying the queen. According to her inference, since Su Lu couldn't escape, the possibility of her being able to break through the wall was not high. What kind of lock can't even be opened by you? Or did you forget to open the toolbox? Wai Chaoshi gently brushed the dust off her military uniform and sat in the chair to ask a very important question. After Sang Shuhai joined hands to escape, she had long confirmed that Su Lu had inherited and even surpassed Nasri's mechanical talent, so it was very difficult to believe that there was a lock in the world that could stop him. "I'm prepared. I brought the most commonly used tools and equipment." Su Lu sat down on the other side of the table and narrowed his eyes at the alloy door not far in front of him. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "It's just that the lock used for this alloy door is a large alloy rod." "You mean, the most primitive kind of door lock?" Wai Chaoshi asked with confusion. "Correct. The mechanical education I received since I was young is that the most primitive tools built according to the simplest laws of physics are the least likely to break. The tools mentioned here also include locks." Time ticked by. The two of them sat across from each other at the table, not saying a word. The soft light above their heads shone down. They didn't know how much the sun outside the room had shifted. They didn't know what the person on the other side of the table would do next. They also didn't know how long it would take for this dark and strange situation to end. Even now, these two most powerful experts of the younger generation still didn't understand how and why the great teacher had captured them. A plate of fruit and a few glasses of water appeared on the transmission table on the alloy wall. Su Lu saw that Wai Caoshi's face was gloomy and didn't seem to have any intention of doing anything. He sighed in his heart and took them and placed them on the table. At this time, an ultra-thin scroll of light unfolded on the wall. A voice that sounded particularly crazy at this time appeared in front of the two of them together with a pair of white legs. Without waiting for the great teacher outside the room to speak, Wai Chaoshi suddenly stood up and said angrily and gloomily, "My subordinates are still waiting outside the mansion. Everyone knows that I'm here. I don't care what's wrong with you and why you've locked me up, but you can't keep me locked up forever, otherwise what?" On the screen, the great teacher's charming face flashed with a trace of embarrassment and anger. He shouted loudly, "I indeed forgot about this problem. But can't I keep you locked up forever? Don't forget that this is the great teacher Fan Manor. Don't forget the blood oath. Without my permission, who the fuck dares to barge in? For more than 700 years, not a single emperor has dared to break this rule. Do you think your father dares?" Su Lu, who had been carefully guarding against Wai Caoshi's sudden rage, quietly listened to the conversation between her and the great teacher Fan. Although he didn't know what the blood oath was, he could roughly guess that it was some kind of agreement between the great teacher Fan Manor and the imperial family. Knowing that the imperial family didn't dare to casually enter the great teacher Fan Manor, although he was also one of the prisoners, he still calmed down a little. Then he thought about how the great teacher Fan Manor had said that for more than 700 years, not a single emperor had dared to enter the great teacher Fan Manor without permission, but he just happened to enter last night. It could be said that he was extremely daring, and he couldn't help but feel a little proud. Fuck, back then, my sister wanted to divorce him, but he refused. Did he think that this daddy wouldn't dare to take revenge? The great teacher on the screen thumped his chest loudly. Wai Chaoshi painfully held her forehead, clenching her left fist. She helplessly said, "How could the Holy Emperor allow a divorce? Besides, this is already something from countless years ago. Why do you still hold a grudge? This is a matter between husband and wife, and even a daughter like me can't do anything about it. don't tell me you want to take revenge on the Empire over this matter. I implore you to quickly wake up. I still have to hurry to the front lines. The great teacher Fan ignored her stern questioning. After taking a deep breath, he said with an incomparable intoxication, "Front lines? War? No, before this war is over, don't even think about leaving this specially made prison cell." "Why?" Huai Chaoshi and Su Lu asked at the same time. Then, they looked at each other, narrowed their eyes, and turned their heads. "Su Lu, if you go back and the people of the Federation know that you're still alive, that Mr. President who loves you to the bone will definitely mold you into a godlike hero. The technical supervisor who originally enjoyed the treatment of a division commander will definitely be promoted to the commander of the new 17th Division. The new 17th Division of the Federation has already landed on the administrative planet of the Prune County star system. It is the main assault force of this war zone. To become the commander of the Federation's main division at such a young age, besides Li Pifu, who else has done this? If Su Lu could successfully escape from the Empire and return to the Federation, or perhaps return to the Federal forces, then what the great teacher said might happen. But when he heard these words, he didn't feel the slightest bit of satisfaction, only heaviness and anxiety. His comrades had already attacked the Empire's borders, and Old White and the brothers of Group 7 were fighting with their lives on the bloody battlefield, but he had no way of fighting alongside them. Huai Chaoshi had long known about this battlefield intelligence, so she didn't have much of a reaction. "And Your Highness, you are the god of the imperial armies. The morale of the soldiers and your personal strength are unparalleled in the world. This time, you will lead 500 Wolf Fang mecha to form a new mecha column and head to the war zone. You will definitely illuminate the heavens and spread your might far and wide." Only now did Su Lu know that this noble princess beside him was actually going to put herself in danger and head to the battlefield to fight. He silently thought that the people of the Empire had always been used to forming full mecha tactical units, but the Federation had only gradually changed their tactical concepts after the successful development of the MX 2 years ago. It was completely conceivable that Huai Chaoshi, with her terrifying combat ability, and a group of beast-like Wolf Fang mecha, would bring heavy casualties to the Federal forces on the planet's surface. Unless Madman Li faced her directly, there would be only a sliver of a chance, but what's more important for you two youngsters is not your role on the battlefield, but your status in your respective countries and the influence you may have on this universe in the future. Su Lu, who had been silent for a long time, finally opened his mouth and said, "I'm very afraid that you would compare me with the princess of your country, but I hope you can get to the point. I hate war. My family hates war the most. I love literature, peace, and love." Grand Master Fan raised both of his hands in excitement on the screen and said loudly, "If I can lock up the two most dangerous enemies in the universe, who will definitely have the most important positions in the future, and make them friends, then this war that is destined to last for many years will definitely be greatly reduced in cruelty, and even, peace." Naive mental patient. Su Li's expression was blank from shock, and he subconsciously said softly, "Crazy immature child." Huai Chaoshi was still holding her forehead in pain as she cursed in a low voice. "I'm not naive, and I'm not crazy." Grand Master Fan stared at the camera very seriously and said, "If you two die in this war, or become truly irreconcilable enemies of life and death, this matter will really be very difficult to resolve, so I have to do my best to keep you alive and get along peacefully. Your peace, perhaps in the distant future, will be the peace of the universe." Hearing this, Huai Chaoshi put down her hand that was covering her forehead. The flames in her narrowed eyes seemed to want to burn down everything in the world. She stared at the familiar and crazy face on the screen, and her tone was extremely cold. She said coldly, "Don't forget, you are a citizen of the Empire. You imprisoned me here, and what will happen to the war on the front lines if you lose? The history of the Empire should not pay the price of your insanity with blood." "We are not citizens of the Empire," Grand Master Fan calmly replied outside the room. "From the moment you came here, you are citizens of the Empire." Huai Chaoshi coldly rebuked. Don't forget that your blood and the blood of the royal family have long been inseparably mixed together. I have the blood of Grand Master Fan's family in me, but your mother is also a member of the royal family. That's right. Grand Master Fan was silent for a long time before he said, living here, I am a citizen of this place, I am a citizen of the Empire, but His Majesty and you should both know that the comprehensive strength of the Empire and the Federation is too different. Even if we use the vast universe as a strategic space to retreat in exchange for a chance to breathe, how far can we retreat? In the end, the Empire will not be able to win this war. It has been decades. When has the Federation's invasion not been repelled by us? Huai Chaoshe raised her clear eyebrows slightly and replied slowly and with great strength. The Federation has never fought a war before, so their army was a pile of shit at the beginning. However, the war has trained them. The federal forces that have passed through the space channel have become stronger each time. In fact, in the last war, Li Pifu and his disciples had already seized the absolute victory. Grand Master Fan's expression gradually turned desolate as he said faintly, now that Nasri is dead, who can go to the headquarters of the federal forces and cause a huge explosion? Huai Caoshe's eyelids drooped slightly and then lifted up. They were inexplicably bright. She said calmly and confidently, me. You can't. Grand Master Fan said firmly, because you are not a citizen of the Federation. You are not Li Pifu's brother. You are not him. Huai Chaoshe was silent. Su Lu was also silent. He was somewhat unsettled by the mention of the uncle's name and the huge explosion. Was the Federation's failure last time really because of the uncle's betrayal? Time passed bit by bit, just like the dew on the glass on the surface of the pear wood table slid down slowly and disappeared into the wood grain. The Grand Master on the light screen got rid of his previous desolate expression. With a hint of a playful smile, he said, if you can't be friends, then get married. This sentence was like a chain of thunder, hitting Su Lu and Huai Chaoshe so hard that they raised their heads in shock. They looked at each other speechlessly, and 2 lines of tears silently flowed down from their hearts. Su Lu, you should have read Schiller's crazy, infatuating ancient knight novel. You should know that everything in the world is like a shadow woven from bubbles. Only love is real. Xiao Shi is a little older than you, but there is no problem with an older sister falling in love with a younger brother. As a loyal fan and the best researcher of Schiller's plays, I think you should know that since Jian Shui'er is your sister, your best choice is her. Of course, Xiao Shi is not as pretty as her sister, but I think this cell will give you plenty of time to cultivate your feelings. Xiao Shi, seriously and without prejudice, think about my suggestion. Sacrifice your love to save the entire universe. After saying this, the light screen slowly pulled up. The Grand Master once again floated away, leaving this secluded space to the young man and woman with strange expressions. Just now, he said that I'm not as pretty as my sister. Who is this sister he's referring to? To Su Li's surprise, Huai Chaoshe did not angrily pick up the pear wood table and launch the most terrifying attack in the universe. Instead, she sat quietly on the chair and asked such a question. According to him, Jian Shui'er is your half-sister from the same mother but different fathers. That is to say, Jian Shui'er is Nasri's daughter and your half-sister. Su Lu shrugged. He did not want to admit it, but he also did not want to clear up this troublesome relationship again. He was surprised to find that Huai Chaoshe could actually immediately determine who Jian Shui'er's father was. It seemed that the affair between the Empress and the uncle was not an absolute secret that no one knew. Huai Chaoshe narrowed her eyes and asked him, what is this eightfold symphony? Su Lu woke up and thought of a famous boring plot in Schiller's night novel. Looking at the cell that was very similar to the plot and Her Highness across the table in a neat military uniform, he was immediately dumbfounded. He sucked in a breath of cold air and cursed, what a fucking lunatic. He has always been a lunatic. Huai Chaoshe said expressionlessly. Su Lu looked at her delicate facial features and his fingers trembled slightly. He thought to himself, if you've seen Schiller's Eightfold Symphony, you definitely won't be as relaxed as you are now. He warned with extreme seriousness, don't eat fruits, don't drink water. Chapter 628. After learning the brief content of Schiller's play from Su Lu, the cold flames in Huitzhauscher's eyes burned brighter and brighter, as if they wanted to melt all the ice mountains that had accumulated for thousands of years into blue flames. But strangely, she didn't turn her anger into any concrete action. Instead, she sat silently on the chair. After a long, suffocating silence, she suddenly took off her military cap, rubbed her slightly curly black hair, and wiped off a few drops of sweat from her forehead. She looked forward and narrowed her eyes, asking, imprisoning us in a room and using an aphrodisiac, does that mean that in the eyes of that lunatic, I don't have the charm of a woman at all? Su Lu slowly and strenuously turned his head to look at her delicate side profile. He was so shocked that he couldn't speak for a moment. He never thought that the powerful Princess Huitzhauscher was seriously thinking about the content of the aphrodisiac instead of how to escape. George Carlin once wrote a famous joke with a sarcastic tone, even if a woman is on the battlefield, when faced with the whistling missiles, she is most likely most concerned about whether the outline of her eyebrows is beautiful or not. But the powerful princess actually had a similar reaction at this moment. Su Lu couldn't help but be shocked. It seemed that no matter how powerful a woman was, she was still a woman. And women, this wonderful creature, must have come from another parallel universe. He would never be able to understand it in his life. If you weren't always expressionless, hiding your face under the shadow of the military cap, I think anyone would have to admit that you would at least be considered delicate. Su Lu didn't explain that the aphrodisiac had nothing to do with her feminine charm. It was purely because it was a classic scene in Schiller's play. The great teacher, a middle-aged fanatic for literature, would definitely design it according to the original. He paused for a long time and said sincerely, but the problem is, it's really hard for me to see you as a woman. I understand. Huitzhauscher put the military cap on the table and replied expressionlessly, it's hard for men to see me as a woman because they are more like weak women in front of me. This was true. In the vast universe, it was hard to find a male animal who could look down on you and was qualified to protect you. Su Lu silently thought to himself, and then he recalled that Shang Qiu had once said something similar. Only now did he realize that all the women who had appeared in his life were actually such fierce and powerful existences. Time passed steadily and monotonously. Outside the prison cell, it should have already entered the night. In this long night, there was no food, no water, no television, and no internet to pass the time. There were only two young men and women who had no feelings for each other. In this awkward environment, the speed of time passing unconsciously slowed down. What kind of man do you like? Su Lu got up and left the shallow pear blossom chair. He walked to the bottom of the scroll-like light screen and looked up. He asked casually, just like those adolescent girls who were hugging a pillow and hiding in bed asking their best female friends. Me? I never thought about it. Huitzhauscher narrowed her eyes and stared at Su Li's back. As a woman, she must have thought about this question. Su Lu didn't turn around and said to himself. Huitzhauscher's previous performance already showed that her heart wasn't a biological pervert. Then, she must have the psychological process that a normal girl should have. They were both soldiers who were in a state of absolute hostility. There were no feelings between men and women at all. However, after several battles and escaping in the sea of mulberry trees, it was inevitable that there would be some feelings of sympathy. In their respective life domains, there were very few equally powerful existences. Therefore, Huitzhauscher used indifference and calmness to hide the pride and loneliness of an expert in her heart. Su Lu used silence and cheerful smile to hide the inhuman feelings that had once appeared in his heart. Especially for Huitzhauscher, there had never been someone who dared to probe into her private matters like Su Lu. There had never been someone who had the qualifications to have an equal conversation with her. After a long period of silence, Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and replied, "When I was young, I seemed to like the palace music teacher. He had a pair of blue eyes, very white skin, and a tall and thin figure. It was as if he would be blown away by the wind." Could it be that the biological process of love in this princess body was a simple compliment? Su Li's lips moved and he almost laughed out loud. He never would have thought that the powerful and terrifying genius Huai Chaoshi would actually like this kind of pale artistic youth. Of course, you can't be like that guy outside who has the hobby of running around naked, and you can't be as crazy as him. Huai Chaoshi's eyebrows were tightly knitted as she quickly added. Su Li took out the tool he carried with him and inserted it into some kind of spring in the alloy wall. He gently twisted it and casually asked, "What happened to that music teacher later?" "There was no later." Huai Chaoshi returned to her usual expression and coldly replied, "There was also no story that you Federation people want to hear the most. He should still be alive and well right now." Su Li shrugged. He had already guessed this ending. A young princess falling in love with her own music teacher was indeed a very common scene. However, since that music teacher had a pair of blue eyes like the sea, he was definitely not a noble, let alone a member of the royal family. Naturally, this story had no later. "What are you doing?" Huai Chaoshi watched him pry open the alloy wall and frowned in confusion. "I'm making that light screen unable to work." In Schiller's play, the trapped male lead blocks the stone hole, thus making the evil person with the hobby of voyeurism unable to endure and find a way to escape. Su Li carefully moved the tool in his hand to avoid triggering the high voltage installed in the wall. He explained, "You can think that I'm playing along with that crazy music teacher, but I think this is indeed effective. At least we won't be disturbed." He walked back to the table and sat down. He lowered his head and organized the tools in the box. Suddenly, he thought of something and shook his head. "I think I'm wrong. He's your uncle, so he shouldn't have such a perverted hobby. Besides, we're not related by blood. Even if he is a pervert among perverts, it's meaningless." Huai Chaoshi did not reply. The two of them sat on opposite sides of the pale pear blossom table and began to be silent again. One was the princess of the empire, the other was the hero of the Federation. It was not easy for them to chat in such an environment without risking their lives. However, it was impossible for them to become true friends through conversation according to the great teacher's naive idea. How could they not be enemies when they loved each other on opposite sides of the river of hatred? It should be early in the still dark morning. The two people in the cell sat in silence for a night with helpless emotions. No matter who it was, they all had extraordinary abilities and extraordinary mobility that ordinary people could not hope to achieve. However, that master only used the simplest method to trap the two of them in a death trap. "I'm really stupid, really." Huai Chaoshi, whose short hair was messy, suddenly broke the silence. She looked at Su Li with narrowed eyes and said with a smile, "I actually forgot the simplest method to solve this problem." Su Li's eyes also narrowed, because he sensed great danger from Huai Chaoshi's smile. "The reason the lunatic outside imprisoned us is very simple. He needs me to be close to you." Huai Chaoshi said concisely, "If I kill you, there will be no reason for this crazy thing to continue. I will naturally be able to leave." Chapter 630. Su Li stared at her clenched fist hanging by his waist. The muscles on his back contracted until he felt a burning pain. His mind was highly focused, but his reply did not stop at all. He said mockingly, "Idiot. That lunatic locked you and me up because he's just a mentally ill middle-aged artistic man trying to influence history and get rid of the delusion of war. If I die, he'll lock you up for life, because the effect is the same as locking us up alive." With a loud thud, the only light pear blossom table in the room finally shattered into countless pieces. Huai Chaoshi stared at the large crater under her feet and the reflection of the cold alloy at the bottom of the crater. She clenched her fists tightly in anger. At this moment, she should have already boarded a battleship and left planet Tianjing, rushing towards the border star regions at the fastest speed possible to lead her most loyal Mecha Division subordinates to battle the Federation's army. However, she was now imprisoned by a lunatic and was unable to escape. Furthermore, she was forced to be locked up together with a great enemy of the Federation. What made her feel the most humiliated and furious was that her lunatic uncle had actually thought of such a disgusting and filthy idea. Because of one thought, countless thoughts were born. She clenched her fists tightly and stared at Su Lu with narrowed eyes, not listening to his analysis. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed, feeling the oppressive feeling in the cell that made it harder and harder to breathe. Facing a powerful opponent that was gradually approaching, although he was not completely fearless, he maintained his normal tone and expression, even calmer than usual. There's only the two of us in this cell. If you kill me, you'll only have a cold corpse to keep you company. That won't be a good feeling, he suggested in a seemingly serious manner. I've seen many corpses since I was very young, Wai Chaoping said indifferently as she raised her chin slightly and took a step forward. But you don't have the experience of cleaning up corpses. Su Lu replied, the current temperature is suitable for people to take a walk by the river, but it's not suitable for keeping corpses. Corpses will rot in a very short time. Have you seen a giant? That's when the internal organs of a corpse are inflated after they rot. He gestured a certain distance with his hands and said seriously, when the time comes, my leg will be swollen like this, the veins on it will be exposed, and the black and smelly blood will flow everywhere. Wai Chaoshi waved her hand to stop him from explaining in detail. With a hint of mockery, she replied, do you think I'm one of those noble ladies who run in the foggy forest holding up their skirts and screaming when they see little rabbits? After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, no. It's just that based on our interactions these days, I'm sure, you have mysophobia. Huai Caoshi's eyes narrowed even more. She stared at him for a long time without saying anything. She was like a powerful god whose halo had suddenly been dispelled, revealing her most fatal weakness. If I kill you, even if my uncle continues to lock me up, I think he will take your body away and burn it to ashes or feed it to the dogs. Her voice was still calm, but the meaning of her words was gradually becoming more and more vicious. It was probably because Su Lu had seen through her mysophobia, which made her very angry. If you haven't forgotten, I've just destroyed all the surveillance equipment in this room, leaving only a one-way light screen. Su Lu used 2 fingers to hold a few data cables and patiently tried to persuade her. The surveillance is broken, but I still have to deliver food. If I don't take it, the outside will naturally know there's a problem. What problem? We're on a hunger strike. I believe that the crazy great teacher has a very high judgment of our survival ability. He won't pay attention to us for a few days, and these few days are enough for my body to rot into a pile of rotten meat full of flies and maggots crawling everywhere. Su Li's narrowed eyes gradually relaxed, and a bright light appeared in his pupils. He smiled as he described the various filthy and tragic scenes after his death, but he didn't feel disgusted at all. And I have to remind you, everyone knows your ability. As long as you're in the cell, who in the great teacher fan manner would dare to open the cell door and drag my body out? By this time, this conversation about the speed of decomposition and the princess mysophobia had been going on. Huai Chaoshi had already walked in front of Su Lu. The woman's face, which could be considered pretty, flashed with a coldness. A powerful and suffocating aura rushed out, seeming to make the thick alloy walls of the cell shake uneasily. Under this kind of violent pressure and the threat of death, Su Li's face finally turned slightly pale. Soon after, his incomparably tyrannical expression turned calm. His narrowed eyes became brighter, and his thin lips were tightly pursed. Whoosh! Huai Caoshi's expression was cold. She lowered her waist, raised her elbow, and smashed her right fist towards Su Li's face without any fancy moves. However, it was this simple punch that seemed to have smashed a hole in the air, a hollow. Endless gushing power followed this passage that had been created out of nothing, and rushed towards Su Li's cheek. In an instant, a strong wind blew, blowing until the eyelashes on Su Li's single eyelid couldn't stop trembling. Su Li's right hand was also trembling. His entire body was trembling, but naturally, it wasn't because of fear. Huai Caoshi's pupils violently constricted in the next moment, because she found that her powerful fist was blocked by a wall. It was a thick and solid wall that was constantly trembling and moving. Every time it trembled, it absorbed a little of her strength and weakened it a little. That strange repulsive force made her feel a faint sense of fear for the first time in her life. The wall was Su Li's hands that were blocking in front of her face. His right hand twisted, sticking close to Huai Caoshi's right wrist, and then like a sharp blade, it slid over. Where the palm arrived, the military uniform on Huai Caoshi's right arm was peeled off piece by piece, and amidst sizzling noises, it turned into countless soft pieces of tattered cloth. Huai Caoshi's pupils constricted. She sensed that the palm contained a power that didn't seem to be inferior to her own, and endless doubts appeared in her heart. She didn't understand how this Federation man in front of her could become so much more powerful than before after disappearing for more than half a year. Right now, there was no time for this imperial princess who had never lost before to think. She narrowed her eyes, capturing that palm that was as fast as lightning in front of her. Her right shoulder suddenly pushed back, and instead of retreating, she pushed forward. Almost at the same time, her left hand formed a semicircle around her waist, and the knuckle of her middle finger fiercely and incomparably sharply smashed down towards the empty space in front of her. As expected. If her sharp strike didn't hit that point in the air, then Su Li's tyrannical palm blade would have quietly left her right arm in a semicircle and chopped at her neck. However, there were no ifs, and there were no buts. Her sharp strike directly hit Su Li's originally unfathomable sneak attack, and fiercely struck his wrist, emitting a bone-chilling sound of collision. Su Li had indeed successfully fooled her after pretending to be weak for such a long time, and he had found the best opportunity to launch a surprise attack. However, even under such a dangerous situation, her mind still didn't waver in the slightest. Just like how the spirits in the forest could smell the scent of smoke from 1,000 miles away, she could also smell the hidden danger from who knows where. Moreover, she didn't hesitate to smash down towards that most dangerous spot. Schemes and tricks, opportunistic techniques, they were all existences of nothingness in front of powerful strength. Difficult knots couldn't block the king's sword, and fatal dangers couldn't block the empire's princess's smash. The smash that seemed to be a gamble actually reflected Huai Caoshi's astonishing combat strength and experience. This could only be attributed to talent, just like the similar talents that Su Li and Madman Li had. No one could imitate or learn from them. The two most powerful young people in the Empire and the Federation were silently engaged in a life-and-death struggle in this strange prison cell. They were not like beasts, but more like machines. After missing her attack, Huai Caoshi unreasonably took another step forward. Her right hand moved like lightning along Su Li's left arm, and her thumb pressed down on the vital point below his ear. Her left arm turned into an iron rod, and with a gust of wind, she followed Su Li's palm and struck below his ribs. If this strike landed, who knew how many of Su Li's ribs would be broken? It was even more likely that the alveoli in his lungs would be shattered in an instant. However, after all, she was facing Su Li, the Su Li who had experienced the miserable experience of having all of his meridians shattered. Through his powerful willpower, he was resurrected and even improved. She was facing Su Li who also possessed talent that others couldn't hope to match. She was facing Su Li who, for the first time, fought with the mentality of a weakling in a head-on battle. Moreover, she was going against her nature and using countless words and expressions to confuse the enemy. Su Li. The 10 stances that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him since he was young had long been integrated into his blood. His bones had become an inseparable part of his muscle memory. He had found an extremely rare opportunity, an opportunity that could possibly defeat the insufferably arrogant Huai Caoshi. All of his spirit and strength were mobilized. All of his muscle fibers were crazily squeezing and rubbing together. He never thought that he could knock down Huai Chaoshe in one strike. He even predicted that Huai Chaoshe would be able to avoid his hidden second strike. As a result, his brain didn't go through this process at all. He directly relied on his intuition and instincts to suddenly raise his left knee and push it against the inside of his opponent's thigh. At the same time, his right arm that had just swung out horizontally behind his shoulder, avoiding his opponent's right arm and smashing towards Huai Chaoshe's forehead, Huai Chaoshe fell. This was the first time in her dazzling and undefeated battle career that she had fallen. In the final moment when life and death were about to be decided, or perhaps it was better to say in the instant when both of them perished together, her left arm forcefully shifted the angle of attack, smashing into the edge of Su Li's treacherous right knee. Then, she inconceivably raised her arm like lightning, blocking Su Li's right arm under her armpit. However, she couldn't stop her opponent's berserk strength, breaking who knew how many of her ribs that were of the same thickness as a normal person's. Her body fell heavily into the crater on the ground. The muffled sound shook up a few strands of inconspicuous dust. However, she immediately supported her body and maintained a sitting position. Blood seeped out from the corners of her lips. She stared at the Federation man not far away with unprecedented vigilance and killing intent. That Federation man also fell. From the looks of it, his injuries weren't any lighter than hers. However, for some reason, when Huai Chaoshe saw that fellow leaning against the wall and coughing out blood non-stop, she felt the true meaning of the word terrifying for the first time in her life. It wasn't just because he was already quite powerful to begin with. Now, he was even more powerful than before. Instead, it was because in this short and dangerous battle, this Federation man exuded a cold feeling of indifference towards life and death. Chapter 631. Su Lu stopped coughing. He coughed up blood, and he coughed up blood with a joyful smile. His back slammed heavily into the wall, shaking off the cement and plastic layer, revealing the cold alloy material underneath. He coughed up blood incessantly, clutching his aching lower abdomen that was about to go numb. He sat on the ground with his legs spread apart in an ungraceful manner, leaning against the wall. He stared at Huai Chaoshe in the pit, but there was no fear in his eyes. There was only boundless brightness, and within that brightness, there was an uncontrollable joy. He had expended a great deal of energy to set up this opportunity, and it had indeed seriously injured Huai Chaoshe. However, Huai Chaoshe's strength still exceeded his expectations. He never thought that at the last moment, Huai Chaoshe's left arm would actually be able to block his knee strike in such a short amount of time, and then clamp his fatal punch under her armpit. What he found most inconceivable was that when his right arm struck Huai Chaoshe's ribs, under that intense pain, the other party was actually strong enough to clamp down on his right arm for an instant. In that instant when he lost control, Huai Chaoshe's leg, which had been nailed to the ground like a nail, lifted up and kicked him in the lower abdomen. He was also seriously injured, but so what? Huai Chaoshe, this combat genius who had shocked the universe in her adolescence, the Empire's military idol who had never lost, still fell in front of him, battered and exhausted as she fell into the pit that he had created. No matter how strong the enemy was, in the end, she was still only one person. Originally, her face would pale, she would vomit blood, and her ribs would break. Even the sound of breaking was no different from that of a normal person. Confirming this point was very meaningful to Su Lu. It was a positive meaning that made him laugh. Actually, cough cough, just now, cough. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, breathed heavily a few times, and looked at the pale-faced Huai Chaoshe in the pit, his eyes slightly narrowed, and said, "What I really wanted to say just now was, why did you kill me?" Su Lu dared to face Madman Li, who was invincible in the Federation, without blinking, dared to charge into the Medellin building with a bunch of guns, dared to single-handedly charge into the Empire's defense line to activate the glory of the Charter. There was no need to doubt his perseverance, courage, and the confidence that was deeply hidden under his ordinary appearance and the pride in his bones. Only this kind of person would chase after Zhong Sugu from the Federation to the Empire in a seemingly crazy manner and carry out that petty revenge from morning till night. When he and the old thing cooperated to kill the Empire's fleet and assassinate the butcher Countess Chaoshi, his life finally blossomed with the most dazzling brilliance in that instant. However, just like many of Schiller's tangled literary scripts, just as he was about to be a soul-stirring hero of the universe, abruptly ended in the hands of a peach miasma mecha and that powerful woman. Since then, facing that woman of the Empire, he could no longer find absolute and firm confidence, let alone the belief that he would definitely win. This kind of feeling was very bad. It was like his orgasm was forcefully interrupted, and before the flower bloomed, it wilted in pain. It was just like the feeling that kept coming from his lower abdomen. It wasn't until this moment that the powerful and terrifying Imperial Highness finally collapsed like an ordinary person that Sulu finally spat out the stuffy breath in her chest. She spat out that seemingly calm sentence, but in fact, it was filled with ruthlessness. What right do you have to kill me? Do you have the ability to kill me? I always thought that I was open-minded enough to determine your combat ability, but today it seems that I still underestimated you. Huai Chaoshi slowly wiped the blood dripping from the corner of her mouth, her voice slightly hoarse. But do you really think that just because you opened your meridians and learned a little bit of true qi externalization, you can be my opponent? Su Lu frowned as he looked at his swollen abdomen. His thick eyebrows gradually knitted together. He subconsciously thought that if he dodged that kick a little slower, perhaps he would already be dead by now. Then his pupils violently shrank. Because from the corner of his eyes, he clearly saw that Huai Chaoshi, who used her hand to support her tottering body a moment ago, was actually slowly standing up at this moment. He knew very well how many of her ribs were broken, and he also knew that the intense pain definitely couldn't be transferred by human will, but she still stood up again. Perhaps we need to try again and see if I can kill you or not. Huai Caoshi's face was indeed a little pale, but her hoarse voice was exceptionally calm, as if she wasn't at all affected by the heavy injuries on her body. The human body was the #1 machine, but, after all, it couldn't be a machine. Su Lu looked at this inconceivable scene and thought of the uncle's words back then. He used the shortest amount of time to calm down the shock in his heart. Supporting himself against the cold alloy wall, he slowly stood up and forced his mind away from his lower abdomen. He didn't think about whether the intense pain meant that his intestines were broken or not, and gently moved his slightly cracked right wrist. Again. Huai Chaoshi slightly raised her face, looking at the ceiling of the cell expressionlessly, and took a deep breath. The unique spirit that seemed to be unique to her once again returned to her body, and all the injuries, pain, and anger disappeared. What was left was only power. Su Lu didn't answer. He just narrowed his eyes and clenched his fists again. According to the calculation of the sounds I heard, the two people in the room should have already fought 3 rounds. Guess who has the advantage? That expressionless niece of mine. No. Although the entire universe knows how strong she is, that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu is Nasri's son after all. If he can have a third of Nasri's wisdom and shamelessness, plus his original strength, Chaoshi can't possibly be his opponent. How strong was he originally? I don't know, but according to the speed of his recovery after being paralyzed, he should have passed the legendary level. No one knows what level he can reach in the future. After all, according to the ancient records of the family, the great ancestor who founded the family didn't seem to have broken through this level. Well, that's very painful. Since they're still fighting, it should be a draw. But according to the terrifying battle strength of these two guys, they should have been seriously injured. How can they still fight? I don't know if the bones of these two guys will be fine in the end. Wearing a thin white robe, the great teacher of the Empire straightened his teacup and spread his smooth bare legs. He half reclined on the bamboo chair and looked in the direction of the alloy cell. Heavy crashing sounds came from the sealed cell from time to time. The dust on the walls rustled down. It seemed that the thick alloy walls were about to shake under the impact of the bodies of the two people inside. The great teacher seemed to be casually commenting on the battle in the cell, but the anxiety in his eyes couldn't be hidden. He knew what kind of danger every heavy crash represented. Bang! 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 Dull and terrifying crashing sounds kept ringing out from the prison cell. No one knew when it would end, and when it ended, whether the two of them would still be alive. The great teacher was indeed a crazy person, but he wasn't a bloodthirsty person. Especially in his opinion, the two young people in the cell were not only important figures related to the future peace of the universe, they were also his family. The great teacher lowered his head and looked at the rippling tea in his cup. He was silent for a long time. Master, we can't let them continue fighting like this, right? If they really die, your great dream can't be realized. Also, His Majesty will definitely not care about the blood oath. He will directly send troops to flatten the yard. What are you afraid of? A trace of embarrassment flashed across the great teacher's beautiful and graceful face. As if he didn't want his loyal butler to see his anxiety, he put down the teacup heavily beside him and said loudly, "I'm anxious because I can't see what's happening inside." He waved his arms excitedly. The undefeated princess of the empire against the brave successor of the Federation's military god. Do you know what this is? This is history happening, and I, as the only bystander, a middle-aged historian with a conscience, I actually can't record it firsthand. This is an intolerable failure. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu wiped out all the surveillance equipment. The technical department didn't expect this Federation person to be so amazing in this aspect. Nonsense. Don't forget that he is Nasri's son, the designer of MXT. The great teacher lowered his eyes slightly and said after a pause, "Wait a little longer. If the two crazy people inside don't fight each other to death, open the one-way channel. I want to say something to them." The white-haired butler looked at the quiet streets around the white yard with fear and helplessness. He heard the faint roar of fighter jets and the rolling sound of armored vehicles in the distance. He said sadly, "We can wait, but I don't know if the troops outside and His Majesty in the palace can wait. As long as Xiao Shi's life and death can't be confirmed, the emperor won't go crazy." The crazy great teacher was as calm as a detective at this moment. He said, "Weighing the pros and cons is what a deformed creature like the emperor is best at. But the problem is that the two in the room. It seems that it's impossible for them to develop a love story according to your plan. They're really fighting with no regard for their own lives. There's no meaning in keeping them locked up like this. What do you know?" The great teacher raised his eyebrows and said mockingly, "Fighting is affection, scolding is love. It's said that the ancestors of my race used this trick to conquer many powerful women." Time passed slowly. 2 days and 1 night had passed since Sulu entered the Great Teacher Academy, and 1 day and 1 night had passed since Huai Chaoshi entered the Great Teacher Academy. The Empire finally confirmed what had happened, and the entire upper echelon of Tianjing planet fell into a state of panic and unease. They didn't understand why the important figure in the White Courtyard would imprison the Empire's most trusted and dependable princess. They also didn't understand how he had done it. Countless elite troops of the Empire were urgently mobilized into the capital. They silently and sternly headed straight for the slums. The heavy and huge engineering mechas unceremoniously flattened all the buildings within a few square kilometers. More than 100 Wolf Fang mechas and densely packed armored vehicles were anxiously waiting for orders in the ruins of the slums. They heavily surrounded the White Yard. Without the Emperor's personal order, no one dared to attack this yard. The Empire's military could only watch anxiously and use sophisticated equipment to monitor everything in the yard. They didn't know what was happening in the room. They only knew that from time to time, there would be a chilling sound of heavy impact. It sounded like the ringing of a bell, and every sound would cause people to panic. Chapter 632. The religious ascetics of Bermuda liked to ring the bells the most, but even the most devout ascetics did not have enough willpower and stamina to continue this work for an entire day and night. In the cell of Master White's Fan Manor, Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu fought valiantly for a day and a night in a dark environment without any bystanders. Finally, they stopped. The bell that frightened the imperial soldiers outside the courtyard came to an end and did not ring again. It was impossible for two people who stood on opposite sides to become friends, as that crazy Master Fan Xian had said, and it was even more impossible for them to become partners. But it had to be admitted that in terms of battle, they had always had some sort of tacit understanding, whether it was last year's great escape in the Sea of Mulberry Trees or today's confinement battle, it was always so. At that time, a piece of the soft wall that had been hit by the vibration fell off without anyone noticing, making a soft sound on the rubble. The two people, who were fighting fiercely, slowed down the rhythm of their hands at almost the same time, vigilantly watching each other's every small movement, and slowly retreated to the wall on both sides and sat down. This was tacit understanding, but also helplessness. At this time, Su Lu was already a man of blood. His right arm was completely hanging by his waist, soft as if all the bones were broken. As for his face and abdomen, it was even more bruised and swollen. Huai Caoshu's cheeks were as indifferent as usual, but the blood seeping out from the ribs of her military uniform, her fingertips trembling because of the lack of strength, and her right leg dragging miserably as she retreated, all showed that she was also seriously injured. No one knew how fierce the battle in this confined room was. If it were someone else, they would have died long ago. Only Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu, these two people with tenacious vitality, could hold on and keep fighting. But until now, no one was able to kill the other. The strength in their bodies was almost exhausted, and it was difficult for them to bear the high intensity of the battle. Maybe it was just a possibility. At this moment, sitting separately under the two broken walls, the last flames were still hidden in their bodies, waiting to erupt at any moment to burn the most powerful enemy across from them, who seemed like they could never escape. However, the two of them did not move and did not erupt with the last of their life force. It was probably because this cell gave them a strange feeling. They were only separated from the real world by a thin wall. They could break through the wall at any time and throw themselves into the arms of their loved ones and friends who needed them. They should not gamble their lives here. The paint on the wall was still peeling off from time to time, but the two of them didn't look at it. They sat cross-legged by the wall in their usual positions, seizing every moment to recover their strength as quickly as possible. The clear water sprinkled on the dusty ground, mixed with the smell of blood, there was a faint fishy smell. There was no light in the cell, so it was hard to tell whether it was day or night. The two powerful young men were like wild beasts hiding in their own territories, licking their wounds and accumulating strength, waiting for the next battle. However, their territories seemed to be too close to each other, so close that they could hear each other's breathing and feel what each other was thinking. No one spoke. The passage of time could not be felt in the dark room, and no sound from the outside world could be heard in the quiet environment. However, both Huai Chaoshu and Su Lu were very sure that the outside of Master Fan's manor must be very lively. The entire empire must have sunk into madness. They didn't know what the final explosion of this madness would be like. Su Lu curled up his body and coughed violently, continuously wiping the blood flowing from his lips. He thought with a trace of sadness. Even if he didn't die at the hands of Huai Chaoshu, how could he escape from the encirclement of the imperial armies with such heavy injuries? Your Majesty, we strongly recommend attacking. Inside the imperial palace, a few officers around 30 years old knelt on the ground, their faces full of excitement as they looked at the Supreme Existence's back. Their foreheads were full of blood. One of the officers cried out with grief and indignation, "Your Majesty, no one knows if Her Highness is safe inside. Master Fan's manor does not have heavy firepower. As long as you give the order, our troops will only need 3 minutes to end the battle and rescue Her Highness. Your Majesty, please make a decision quickly. The army cannot do without Her Highness." The officers once again knelt heavily on the ground and kowtowed until the wounds on their foreheads burst open again, and fresh blood flowed out. The emperor, Huai Fuchai, did not turn around. His face was expressionless. He did not have any negative thoughts about these officers who dared to rush him. He knew better than anyone what kind of prestige the daughter he was proud of had in the army. The great teacher is Her Highness uncle. Would he hurt her? Why attack? The emperor casually waved his hand and said, if there really is a problem, she will not be able to come out herself. Do you really think you only need 3 minutes to succeed? We have gathered a mecha brigade and 3 heavy mecha regiments. The officers' backs were already drenched in cold sweat. They clenched their teeth and insisted on their opinion. A group attack will solve the problem. The emperor no longer spoke with these hot-blooded officers loyal to his daughter. He tiredly waved his hand and chased them all out of the imperial palace. Meanwhile, he came to the railing and looked at the endless night and the smear of white on the horizon. He sank into a long silence. After a long time, this man who truly held the most power in the universe muttered to himself, it turns out that the family of geniuses is prone to producing lunatics and idiots. But if this problem could be solved so easily, that courtyard would have been solved hundreds of years ago. In the distance, light seeped out from the shrouded slums, illuminating that white courtyard exceptionally clearly. The emperor frowned slightly as he looked in that direction. He wanted to convince himself that he did not need to worry too much about the daughter he was proud of, but he kept feeling that there was a shadow constantly spinning in his heart. In the early hours of the morning, the night was still dark, but the slums of Jingdo were brightly lit. The mechanical army that had solemnly charged into the slums in the name of a military exercise were nervously waiting for orders on the flattened ruins. The wolf fang mecha that reflected the metallic light shuttled back and forth like ghosts, ready to launch a surprise attack on that white courtyard at any time. The slums and pariahs who lived here were blocked far away from the safety line by the police department and the security department. These lower-class people, who worked all day for survival, looked in that direction with faces full of fear. They did not know what had happened. Many of them looked at their homes that had turned into ruins and could not help but begin to quietly cry. At one of the streets, a fat middle-aged woman was squeezing in the crowd and looking in that direction. From time to time, she would fiercely curse at the people who were fighting for space beside her or rudely push away the tall people in front of her. No one noticed that her eyes were filled with deep worry and unease. "Mom, let's go back." Paul squeezed over, sweating profusely. He looked around nervously, tugged at the cheap clothes on his mother, and said in a low voice, "It can't be brother. Even if brother is a noble who is wanted, it is impossible to cause such a big commotion. The white courtyard that is surrounded is not an ordinary place." Aunt Susan ignored her son's persuasion and did not turn around to leave. She only looked gloomily at the courtyard in the distance that was almost impossible to see clearly. After a long silence, she suddenly said, "That child has not come back for more than 2 days. I don't know why, but I know that he is definitely in there. Although I know that you are Nasri's son and perhaps have the ability to avoid the chip's monitoring, I still did not expect that you could actually hide from the Empire's search for so long. I am very curious, where exactly have you been hiding in this half a year?" In the dark cell without a trace of light, White Saoshir's hoarse and tired voice suddenly sounded. Su Lu was a little surprised that she would speak. After a moment of silence, he said, "Do you still remember the bet we made on the spaceship? I said that I can escape. But I won't tell you how I did it." The room once again returned to a dead silence, only the slight flow of the water mixed with gravel on the ground could be heard. It seems that the Security Bureau and the Intelligence Bureau's control of the slums is really very poor. There are too many things hidden in these dark and filthy areas that cannot be exposed. The pariahs have long been accustomed to dealing with the will of the Empire. It is indeed a very good choice for you to hide here. Su Lu was slightly surprised. He didn't know if the other party had guessed something, so he naturally refused to answer. But listening to the condescension and contempt in her words, he thought of his dear Aunt Susan and Paul. He couldn't help but shake his head and said, "In my opinion, the dark and filthy place you said is really gentle and benevolent. As for the pariahs you said, they have noble sentiments that you nobles can't compare with. What is the name of the stupid woman who was deceived by you?" "Susan. It seems that she is the descendant of a low-level noble. It seems that she is really good to you." Whitesaucher's narrowed eyes glittered in the darkness, not like gems, but like an unsheathed sword. Su Li's pupils suddenly constricted. Forcibly suppressing the shock in his heart and the deeply hidden fear, he said in a deep voice, "You can't find them. You underestimate the Empire's ability." Su Lu was silent for a long time. His tired and heavily injured body seemed so weak at this moment. He said slowly in a hoarse voice, "Tell me your conditions." Huaichaoshu narrowed her eyes like scimitars and looked at Su Lu under the opposite wall through the dark space. After a long while, she said with strong sarcasm, "This is the Empire, and it will be my country in the future. That Susan is my subject. You want me to use my subject to threaten an enemy of the Federation. This is a humiliation to me. I know the thinking habits of you big shots very well. You want to punish Aunt Susan afterwards, which must be in accordance with the law, but in fact, you are threatening me." Whitesaucher's curved eyes flashed with strong anger. After a moment of silence, she said indifferently, "I don't care about your understanding. If it is threatening, what can you promise me? Just like you think you understand my thinking habits, I also understand the thinking habits of you moral peddlers. Hypocrisy is your label, and guilt is the biggest source of pleasure for you. If I ask you to commit suicide, will you agree?" Chapter 633. A mother and wife falling into the river at the same time, a child with no mistakes and a large group of mischievous children standing on the two sides of the track, your loved ones tied up on the torture instruments, and Whitesaucher's mocking and contemptuous words at this moment. These were the most common problems in the world. These problems might make many people feel struggling, from the inside out, from the roots of their hair to their toes, endlessly painful. However, for Su Lu, these problems were just some extremely boring hypotheses. Don't be in a hurry to refute me with those specious logic. For a moralist, morality is only useful as long as it does not harm their core interests. Once your core interests are threatened, you will not hesitate to begin to play the role of the crying victim's family, unwilling to give up a single piece of flesh, but still wanting to seize the moral high ground. Huaichaoshu coldly waved her hand. In her hand was the life of the slum woman. She wanted Su Lu to die by himself. In her eyes, this was just a joke, but this kind of joke was a bit vicious, directly attacking the heart of those moral peddlers. Su Lu listened quietly, and then slowly opened his mouth to reply as usual, "No, of course I won't commit suicide, but I am not the kind of person you are talking about. As for this, I won't explain." His eyes were bright and burning. Without any emotion, he stared at Huaichaoshu under the broken wall across from him and said, "If anyone tries to harm innocent aunties, including you, the only response I can make is to use all methods and power to kill the other party and then save them." Kill? Kill him and the entire steel industry of the Empire like a wild beast? Huitsausher's eyes narrowed slightly, and she lightly laughed. "I know what you are laughing at. You are laughing at my overestimation of my abilities, laughing at my whimsical thoughts." Su Li's voice was hoarse as he replied, "That is because you don't understand what kind of person I am. If you really force me to go crazy, I will become a dog that salivates fiercely, staring at your calf bone, and no matter the cost, I will pounce on you and viciously bite you a few times. I will bite you until you are covered in wounds and ooze endlessly, transmitting my virus to your body. Don't force me. I will really become a dog, a mad dog." "Are you threatening me? What right do you have to threaten me now?" Huaichaoshu frowned and said with a trace of unfathomable emotion. Her Highness' lamentation came from Su Li's self-description. She had not expected that the young man opposite her, who was known for his steadiness and forbearance in the Federation, would be able to so calmly describe the birth of a mad dog. Furthermore, it really made her feel a chill. This man was clearly in a desperate situation, so why did he still dare to threaten her? If that woman named Susan dies, what can you do? Even if you manage to escape, what can you do? In this universe, other than His Majesty, there is no one I truly care about. No matter how much you kill, it will not make me sad or regretful at all. Or are you going to keep killing people in the Empire? Like a violent and stupid terrorist who keeps assassinating nobles and military officers? Maybe. Su Li's eyes were still bright and even burning as he looked at the wall opposite him. That warm little courtyard in the slums, that mother and son who had treated him with the greatest kindness in the world, were now in an unprecedented crisis. If something really happened to Susan and her son, he would not be able to accept it. It's not maybe, it's definitely. If anything happens to Auntie and her son, and I manage to escape this time, I will use the rest of my life to kill all the Empire's nobles I can find at all costs. In those few decades, there will be a calm and patient mad dog wandering your land. I bet you won't be able to catch me again. In fact, if it wasn't for that beautiful bastard outside, you wouldn't have been able to catch me this time either. If you can't catch me, Tianjing planet will continue to bleed. Executing a mother and her son who were not dangerous at all because of anger and forcing me to turn into a rabid dog should do you, your emperor, and your empire no good. After saying this, Su Li stopped talking. The dark cell returned to silence. Only the long and steady breathing of the two people could be heard. Even if the people you want to kill are innocent according to common moral standards, you will still kill them? That's right. This does not conform to your moral standards. Su Li was silent. Huai Chaoshi was silent as well. Although I don't think you can escape, I don't know why, but I am willing to agree to your request and let that auntie of yours go this time. Huai Chaoshi said expressionlessly, according to what we said earlier, you have to agree to a condition of mine. Of course, this condition has nothing to do with the war between you and me. Okay. Su Li replied quickly. The sweat on his back had already drenched his entire body, flowing across his wounds. It was extremely painful. I have seen your files many times and know what kind of role you played in the Federation. You are not a naturally bloodthirsty and violent soldier. You are more like a boring and righteous youth who places morality above his head. This time, for the sake of two citizens of the Empire, you are actually willing to go against your own principles. It seems like you are really scared. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and said indifferently, for a person who has never been afraid of death to be scared to this extent, it is truly rare. Su Li was silent. Ever since he had confirmed that Auntie Susan could die at any moment, an unprecedented sense of fear had taken over his entire body. Because of this unprecedented fear, he had become crazier than ever. Furthermore, this extreme craziness was hidden in his extreme calmness, and it was clearly transmitted to Huai Chaoshi's mind. It was also because she felt this craziness that Huai Chaoshi made her final decision. I don't like the so-called tragedies of fate. Those are all dogs hit written by Schiller. He lowered his head tiredly and replied, my life may not be a comedy, but a good person should always have a happy or peaceful ending. He raised his head and looked straight at the dark wall and the vague figure. He said, actually, you're wrong. Many people in the Federation have also misjudged me. Even my closest friends have misjudged me. I am afraid of death. There is no one in this world who is not afraid of death. When I was 4 years old, I was lying in my bedroom, staring blankly at the sometimes gray and sometimes red sky. That day, I fell sick. I was very sad to discover that the scenery around me would not change, but we would fall sick. Of course, I don't care if I feel uncomfortable when I am sick, but the problem is that you will die when you are seriously ill, and you will also die when you are old. After you die, you don't even know what it is to feel uncomfortable. He raised his left arm, which was the only arm he could barely raise, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He lowered his head and said with a smile, "What is death? There is nothing in death. Those little metal toys, the slag in the mine that shines like diamonds, and the little sister who can't speak with a face as cute as an apple, none of them can be seen, touched, or felt. There is only darkness and silence. No, there is not even darkness and silence. I don't know if I have ever existed or done anything. There are no traces to prove that I have ever existed. If I disappear, perhaps there are people who care, but I can't feel their care. Because in death, even I do not exist. This is very scary. Too scary." Sulu raised his head and said very seriously, "How can you not be afraid of such a scary thing? Those who are not afraid are idiots, or rather, they do not realize how precious it is to have self-awareness. But the problem is that this most terrifying thing is unavoidable." "Then what should we do?" "Continue." Whitesaucher's eyes narrowed in a weird angle. With a rare smile on her lips, she looked at the man of the Federation who was very different from his usual self. Su Li's eyes narrowed, too, as if he was recalling the past and sorting himself. Subconsciously, he waved his hand, as if to drive away the scary prospect, and continued, "Since it is unavoidable, of course, we will have to live more comfortably while we are alive. That is probably the reason why we should enjoy the most pleasure while we are alive." "What kind of pleasure?" Like a cynical subordinate, he shrugged his shoulders, frowned, and quickly dispersed. He said with a smile, "The education rules of human society are too strong and have been deeply rooted in our consciousness. Respect for the old and love the young, loyalty and integrity, these moral views are like a whip. If you touch it, your heart will be whipped. Some people can endure it in exchange for things like money and power, but I don't understand why I have to endure it. I just do things according to these moral requirements of human society. I don't want to be whipped in my life and live with a clear conscience. Isn't that a pleasure? This whip is actually a fire in my heart. When I see those unfair things, those disgusting things, I can't help but burn them. When I burn those things clean, I feel that my eyes are clear and my mood is good. Living like this does not necessarily make my heart strong, but it is comfortable enough. I am afraid of death, and I am not a messenger of justice or a young man. I am just a guy who lives according to his likes and dislikes and the whip of morality in order to seek happiness in life. But if the whip of morality is whipped in the wrong place one day, and I feel that it is unbearable, then I will no longer believe in the placebo of life and become a monster that I don't even know what I will be. The hidden starting point of this state of survival is only to make my life more pleasant. It is the restraint of human civilization for every individual. Back to the whip again. Fine, what I want to say is that this is not selflessness, but the greatest selfishness. Su Li's bright eyes flashed, and he opened his hands and said, "In the end, I have deceived the entire universe. Sometimes, it is a bit embarrassing." The prison cell was quiet for a long time. Whitesaucher's voice, full of emotion, rang out, "If there is more of such selfishness, it is not a bad thing." At this moment, another voice rang out in the quiet room. "So, it seems that our whole family are selfish people?" Chapter 634. In the cell that had been silent and dark for a long time, a voice that did not belong to Su Lu or Whitesaucher suddenly rang out. Naturally, it could only be that master of comparative literature who was crazy enough to carve love and peace on his face. When his voice rang out, Su Lu, who had already spoken a lot, frowned slightly, thinking in confusion that he had already removed all the surveillance equipment in the room. How could that person still hear the voice inside? "I am very surprised, Su Lu. You can actually think like a philosopher, and not like those stinky soldiers who only know how to sit on a rock and smoke. This is very good. It will be very helpful for you to accept my great plan in the end. In the dark cell, Su Lu and Huai Chaoshi looked at each other through the dark air. Neither of them spoke as if in tacit agreement. These two young experts might have fought against each other for many years, or perhaps they would bite each other like wild beasts in the next moment, but their attitude towards the crazy middle-aged man from the Empire outside the cell was surprisingly unanimous. If possible, they definitely would not mind teaming up and tearing that person into pieces. After not hearing a reply for a long time, the great teacher's desire to chat did not find a channel to express. He was clearly somewhat displeased, but in the next moment, his voice became excited again. You have explained the horror of death very clearly, and that is the end of one's self-consciousness. For life forms with self-consciousness, this kind of end is absolutely unacceptable, just like how human society absolutely cannot tolerate the end of self-existence, which is why they created things like love, marriage, family, and motherly love. Regardless of whether it is the literature of the Empire or the Federation, when it comes to describing and explaining death, there is a huge flaw, or perhaps a gap. Black swamps, withered tree trunks, burning underworld, gem-like piles of eyeballs, forest-like white bone plains. These are all too poetic, and any kind of color to describe the existence of death is a type of beautification. Of course, I believe that the predecessors of human society cannot have thought about death at a lower level than you and me. It is just that they were unwilling to lead the life forms that needed to be anesthetized into the deepest part of grief due to their collective consciousness as a member of the human race. This kind of approach is indeed very beneficial for human society. The great teacher's voice was just like every time he talked about words like literature, peace, and love. It became a little sharp, and within the sharpness, there was a hint of craziness. The lazy birds in the trees, the flowers in the birds' dark beaks, the beetles crawling out of the petals, the beetles pushing the big dung ball joyfully. When the dung ball rolls over a small pool of water, it rains. The water flows into the small stream and the big river, and the fish and prawns dance. What is this? He's alive. Withered trees, half-rotted eye sockets, stinking birds, flowers that have turned into black ropes, beetles that are only left with empty shells, there is no cloud and no rain for thousands of miles, the earth is dry, there is not even wind, the streams have long dried up. What is this? This is death. Only by recognizing the horror of death can one truly appreciate the value of life. In this vast universe, everything is fake, only life is real. War is the stupidest decision, killing is the most irrational game, so we must stop all of this from happening. The great teacher's voice was excited and persistent. The only thing that can stop all of this is love, only making love. Only the two of you can make love. The great teacher's exaggerated aria kept echoing in the dark cell. The content of this aria was so strange. The current head of this mysterious family seemed to have really pinned the future of peace between the Empire and the Federation on the physical intimacy between Su Lu and Huai Chaoshi. The room was really dark, but Su Lu seemed to see the shock, anger, and disgrace on Huai Chaoshi's face. In fact, his own expression was also very strange. "Looks like your uncle has really gone mad," he said to the woman under the woman. He said to the woman under the wall in a hoarse voice, "If your subordinate can't come up with a solution, I'm really worried that he'll fill the room with poisonous gas in the next moment. Great teacher, the fan manor should be surrounded by now. This crazy uncle of mine is under too much pressure and is about to break down. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so excited." Huai Chaoshi replied coldly. Although she and Su Lu could not hear the sounds outside the white courtyard, nor could they see the bright searchlights or the dense mechanical army, they knew very well what the situation was like. "I'm not crazy. I'm even more unwilling to let two pitiful and cute young children who are forced to bear the cold pursuit of political interests die," the great teacher retorted loudly from outside the cell. When Huai Chaoshi heard this, she casually scratched her slightly wet and messy hair and said indifferently, "Uncle, you should know very well that the two of us are heavily injured with multiple fractures. It's very difficult to make the two of us suddenly flirt and shake the bed randomly. When Sulu heard this, his heart was filled with endless admiration. It turned out that this princess, who seemed to only like dealing with mecha violence, had a literary style that he had never imagined. "We need food and medicine." Huai Chaoshi made her request to the crazy man outside the cell. The passage in the alloy wall opened, and a plate of clean water, food, and medicine for external injuries were sent in. Sulu turned his body with difficulty and took these things down. He looked at the darkness on the other side in confusion. Outside the cell, the great teacher was still using his poetic and sword-like language to comment on life and death, the birth and destruction of the universe, and the attitude that human civilization should have. In the room, Sulu and Huai Chaoshi listened in silence or did not listen at all. They closed their eyes and took long breaths. Suddenly, really suddenly, without any warning, without any preconditions, the chattering outside the cell suddenly stopped. The inside and outside of the cell once again sank into a deathly silence. After who knew how much time had passed, Sulu opened his eyes. He looked in confusion at the outside of the heavy wall and then at the opposite side. At the same time, Huai Chaoshi also frowned, because this deathly silence had come too suddenly. The two people in the cell knew very well that, based on the personality of the crazy man outside, it was impossible for him to suddenly stop talking at this time. Something must have happened. The problem was that no matter how they thought about it, they could not guess the truth of what had happened. Huai Chaoshi did not think that her father would dare to go against the blood oath and order the army to attack. Sulu did not think that there was anyone in this world who could silently control the great teacher, who used love and peace as his title, but was actually crazy and terrifying. More importantly, even if he could control him, it would be impossible to do so silently. After a long silence, Huai Chaoshi suddenly said, "Try the water and medicine." Sulu was silent for a moment, then asked, "Aren't you afraid that the water and medicine are poisoned, that kind of poison? Are you talking about the aphrodisiac?" Huai Chaoshi raised her eyebrows slightly and calmly replied, "There is such a possibility, so I suggest that you try it first. In your current state, even if you take the aphrodisiac, there shouldn't be any effect." Sulu was silent and looked down at his lower abdomen. The after effects of being kicked by that savage woman a day ago were still there. Although it was not enough to end his bloodline, at least for now, he was definitely unable to make the proper response. The joy of life was helplessness, and the joy of helplessness was probably all in pain and helplessness. He raised his head, wanting to say something, but in the end, he did not say anything. Because the door suddenly opened. Chapter 635. Earlier, an extremely intense quarrel broke out among the Imperial troops who were anxiously guarding the outside of Master Fan's mansion and had raised the streets of the slums to the ground. The two parties involved in the quarrel were Darcy, the director of the Department of Mobility, and a calm Imperial officer whose face was hidden in the shadows with a calm expression. "Qi Dabing, are you crazy?" "No, Director, as an officer of the Imperial Army, even in the face of such a tense situation, I still won't go crazy. His Highness is still in that courtyard. There is no news of him, and we don't know if he is still alive. You actually want all the troops to retreat. If there is a problem." Director Darcy pointed at the officer's nose and said in a gloomy voice, "You are just a little major, how can you bear this kind of responsibility?" This Imperial Army officer was called Qi Dabing. He was an outstanding soldier who suddenly rose in the Imperial Army in the past 2 years. During the aristocratic rebellion last time, he showed his strong military skills and strength, which earned him the recognition of the Imperial Army and the new military headquarters. He was temporarily transferred to the Mobility Bureau in the middle of last year and participated in the operation to capture Sulu. It was also this person who almost intercepted Sulu in the underground waterway. Although he failed in the end, he also brought a lot of trouble to Sulu. "I know the commander of the Imperial Army admires you, but today's operation is under my command." Director Darcy said coldly, "Not to mention, I have a very bad opinion of your past achievements." Chi Dabing was silent when he heard this sentence. He saluted and walked to the broken courtyard wall under the dim morning light. He raised his head and looked at the sky indifferently. He seemed to be thinking about an important problem, but also seemed to be waiting for something important. A few minutes later, the thing he was waiting for finally arrived. Chi Dabing took the light but heavy electronic document from his subordinate's hand. He took a deep breath, and a trace of viciousness flashed across his pale face. He turned around again and walked toward the anxious temporary headquarters. He didn't understand why the organization would take such a big risk and didn't hesitate to expose themselves to tear a hole in the Master Fan's mansion. What exactly happened in the White Courtyard? Who was the one who tore the hole open to let out the person inside? Was the career that he worked so hard for half of his life going to be ruined because of this inexplicable accident? When Chi Dabing walked in front of Director Darcy again, he suppressed the strong sense of unwillingness and sadness. He looked at Director Darcy's face that was distorted by anger and anxiety and said word by word, "Before you repeat your accusation, it's best to read this electronic document, and then I ask you to execute it immediately." Director Darcy frowned and took the electronic document. When he saw the content of the order in the document, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't believe his eyes. However, at the end of the document, there was a black hibiscus electronic seal that had been verified electronically. It was so eye-catching and unquestionable. This was the highest order from the Emperor. Su Lu and Huai Chao Shi, who were in Master Fan's house, did not know that a royal document that had been forged through extremely advanced electronic means had already been sent to the dynasty's troops outside the house. They also did not know that the mechanical troops that had surrounded Master Fan's house for many days and could turn into an iron torrent at any moment were slowly retreating according to this order. In the houses in the slums that had been crushed into rubble, an obscure but very important passage vaguely appeared. They stared blankly at the door that opened silently. The door that seemed to be meant to imprison them for the rest of their lives, to drive them mad with endless darkness, and to turn the madman's absurd ideas of peace, love, and literature into reality, had opened so casually, so inexplicably, and without warning. The light of dawn penetrated through the heavy door, and it was as terrifying as a ghost. The contrast between this kind of psychological expectation and the sudden reality would make many people feel at a loss and unable to move. They would hesitate for a long time before they dared to cautiously poke their heads out, like a herbivore in a cave. They would humbly observe a few times. However, Su Lu and Huai Chao Shi both loved to eat meat. The nerves in their bodies were the thickest in this universe. They might not be the two most fearless people in the world, but they were definitely the two most powerful people in the world. In less than a second, two violent gusts of wind sounded in the cell. The two people rushed out of the room without hesitation as fast as they could. Since the door opened, it meant that there was a big problem inside the Master Fan mansion. The current situation was completely different from before. The two people trapped in the cell were fighting non-stop. At this moment, the most vigilant thing had changed. What Huai Chao Shi had to do was to subdue or kill Su Lu again, and what Su Lu had to do was undoubtedly escape again. However, Huai Chao Shi had the help of countless Empire army troops, and Su Lu only had one person, rushing from the cell into the courtyard. Su Lu, whose arm and lower abdomen were heavily injured, was still a bit faster than Huai Chao Shi, whose thigh was fractured. However, the difference was only a fraction of a second. However, when they entered the courtyard, the two people who should have been running like rabbits and pouncing like tigers were once again stunned. This was because the scene that appeared in front of them was even more shocking than the silent opening of the door. The courtyard under the dim light of dawn was incomparably quiet. There were the sounds of insects in the grass under the trees. There was a recliner on the stone platform, and beside the recliner was a teacup. The hot tea in the teacup was still steaming. However, the great teacher who had trapped them for several days was not in the recliner. The great teacher was in the sky. On the tree. A thick rope hung down from the big tree above. The beautiful, almost demonic middle-aged man of the empire was hanging upside down at the end, swaying gently in the cool morning breeze. The revered great teacher fan in the empire was now like a chained-up chicken. His eyes were wide open in shame and anger, and his mouth was stuffed with a piece of underwear. He tried his best to cry out, but he couldn't make a sound. His wide and thin white robe was pulled down by gravity, occasionally brushing against his red cheeks, revealing a pair of bare and well-proportioned thighs and, even more, bare buttocks and private parts. Su, who was in a hurry to escape, froze. He sucked in a breath of cold air. Huai Chaoshe, who was in a hurry to kill, narrowed her eyes. She immediately stopped in her tracks. Su didn't think much of it. He was just shocked that such an important person could actually put on such a pathetic appearance. However, for Huai Chaoshe, this absurd scene made her feel extremely alarmed. She knew very well what kind of terrifying person this crazy uncle of hers was in reality. He was actually beaten up so miserably. Who in this universe had the ability to do this? Thinking of a person's name, a name that only existed in her memory and the past of the empire, Huai Chaoshe suddenly stopped in her tracks. She instantly raised her fighting spirit to the peak, completely ignoring the pain in her thigh. Like a lion, her sharp gaze swept around. Chapter 636. First, I settled the debt. I took 2 days of leave and wrote 2,000 chapters. In total, I owed 17 chapters and 2,000 words. As promised, I would finish it within 9 months. There was no other way out. I would finish it. Then I apologized. Indeed, I had been tormented quite badly recently. Just as I was thinking that I could start to make up for my debt after the wedding, I went to Jiangnan. Jiangnan was good, the scenery was unforgettable. It was just that I went from the north of the Great Wall, which was slightly further. The first night I asked for leave on the 29th. That wasn't anyone's fault, it was purely my own problem. That night, I was playing and only reached Wuzhen at 6 or 7 p.m. Once we started eating and chatting, it was already late. White Bird brought us a bottle of water and told us to drink beer. Then at night, Blood Red moved 3 more items from the bar. After drinking a few bottles, Mirror Moon Pass's white wine banquet started again. Even later in the night, I actually played poker with White Bird 72 and the other fellows until 2 p.m. So this was all my problem, I did play for an entire day. But I really had no choice but to take leave yesterday. When I woke up in the morning, I had diarrhea. The meeting upstairs had already started, but I was still squatting in the toilet. I was embarrassed by the beautiful editor's phone call. Everyone was waiting for me. It was a really bad feeling. Then there was a serious meeting. It was very important and lasted until 1 o'clock. Then I ate as fast as I could and left as fast as I could. In the end, I forgot my charger. Zhang Xiaohua said that she would send me, but she only had time to see Moon Gate and my back, only Guanguan and I left first. He left because of his book friends and love and work. I left because of love and work and book friends. There was not much difference. The main thing was that I wanted to say that I really wanted to go home early. In the end, yesterday afternoon was really miserable. Guanguan and I switched from a minibus to a taxi to a train. The train ran out of trains, so it was late. We caught it, then changed to the subway. For a whole 5 hours, we ran as fast as we could. In Shanghai's underground space, we could only hear 2 uncles talking. Yu Guan was better than me. His flight was at 9 p.m., while mine was at 7 p.m. He took the bambook and looked at the rebirth office that I recommended. I could only use my phone to read a novel whose name I forgot. The main reason was that I was a little nervous. In the end, when I arrived at Pudong Airport, I found that there was no need to rush at all. I was not afraid of being late, because the flight was late again. Then I flew to Tsingtao. As expected, I was addicted to traffic again. When he got home, he was once again ripped off by a taxi. I took a deep breath of Daching's air and discovered that it was indeed 15 degrees Celsius. I was still wearing my short-sleeved shirt and Chitian unifying the world t-shirt. And so, the delicate fat cat caught a cold as expected. But it was amazing. When he was writing about these things, his spirit was really quite good. It was much better than when he was writing the novel. Cats, they were really rubbish cats. Finally, I have something to report, guys. In September, I want your monthly tickets. I'm not being shameless. I'll definitely be updating a lot throughout September, but I'm not going to explode. I'm just making up for what I owe. Don't get me wrong. You can choose not to contribute at all. You can just watch coldly as I write, and you can contribute when you're happy. I mainly need the precious monthly tickets in your hands so that when I make up for my debt, I'll have more of a physiological impulse. Tomorrow, at least 3 chapters. If you went crazy, it might be even more. Chapter 637. Someone was helping him, and that did not include Huai Chaoshe. The hanged great teacher was a mysterious force that could easily open the alloy door. He was obviously not from the Empire. For Su Lu, who had a clear mind and was calm enough, it did not take him too long to come to such a simple conclusion. A naked middle-aged man of prominent status was hanging upside down in the morning light. The strange scene stunned both of them at the same time, and then they immediately sobered up. However, due to the extreme sense of danger hidden in the darkness, White Caoshe's reaction was naturally slower than Su Li's. Both of them scanned the nearest place at the same time, trying to find a weapon. As long as they could pick up a gun, they would definitely pull the trigger at the other party at the first moment. After going through so many things and the extremely dangerous battle in the dark room, they had long confirmed that to each other and to each other's world, the other party was the most dangerous person. To be able to kill the other party, any kind of sympathy between heroes and heroines, and the loneliness of being at the top was bullshit. But unfortunately and strangely, the mysterious person who restrained the great teacher and released the two of them from the prison cell did not leave Su Lu with a weapon. The morning breeze blew into the white courtyard. There was not a single sound outside the courtyard, and the ignorant eyes of the morning birds were still half closed. Time. What the two of them needed the most at this moment was time. Su Lu did not look at Huai Chaoshe. Squinting his eyes, he saw a piece of paper stuck to the hanged great teacher's head. He reached out his hand and took it down at lightning speed. Like lightning, his legs shot out like lightning, and without any hesitation, he rushed toward the towering white courtyard wall with a hint of determination. He glanced at the piece of paper from the corner of his eyes, and a solemn expression flashed across his face. He did not know the arrangements of the Empire's troops outside the courtyard wall, nor did he know how many dangers awaited him. But no matter what, he was not willing to stay in the same place as Huai Chaoshe and foolishly wait for her to summon the Empire's elite troops to kill him 100 times, 100 times, 100 times. Huai Chaoshe looked at the back of the figure that flipped over the courtyard wall like a big bird. A trace of ruthlessness flashed through his eyes that were narrowed like a new moon. He pressed his right hand on his thigh that was in great pain due to the fracture and shouted loudly. With her legs heavily injured, she knew that she had no way of keeping Su Lu here. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but sigh at that guy's luck. In that desperate struggle, that guy had broken countless bones, but his legs were still intact. Shouting loudly was too much like the reaction of a helpless girl who was robbed in a dark alley. Huai Chaoshe hated this shout very much, but if she wanted to make that guy stay, there seemed to be no other way but to shout. There were a few lines of simple imperial characters on the small piece of paper that the mysterious man stuck on Master Fan's head. It briefly described the situation outside the courtyard wall and wrote down an address. Su Lu knew the story behind this incident very well, but he also found it hard to believe that the imperial troops outside the courtyard wall had actually retreated. He was even more puzzled that the mysterious man had directly stuck the paper on Master Fan's head. Was he not afraid that Huai Chaoshi would see it first? With the resolute determination to die, to live and die together, or to survive in the midst of death, Sulu leaped over the tall courtyard wall. However, he didn't see the torrent of steel that he had imagined, nor did he see countless cannon barrels that were powerful enough to destroy battleships. He only saw a barren ruin in the night. It turned out that what was written on the paper was true. He could faintly see the lights of the Imperial troops several kilometers away. Looking at the night sky at a 45-degree angle, there were roaring fighter jets that were circling at high speed. It was supposed to be a dead end, but it suddenly became a place of life. Sulu was slightly surprised, but he didn't slow down at all. This was because at this moment, White Caoshi's furious roar came from the courtyard behind him. After hearing this roar, the Imperial troops that had retreated to the periphery of the courtyard immediately became restless and moved. It turned out that the ridiculously powerful princess could also scream like a normal girl. A hint of a happy smile flashed across Su Li's face, but there was no trace of a smile in his eyes. He stared at the mecha hidden in the forest several hundred meters away. It was a new type of wolf fang mecha that glowed with a metallic color. The micro-engine parts that looked like metal spikes were attached to it. In the dense forest, it looked like the branches of a tree pointed to the sky. It gave off a strong aura of injustice and resentment. The cockpit of this wolf fang mecha was already half open, and there were no Imperial pilots inside. Su Li's hearing was extremely good, so he could clearly hear the low humming sound of the engine in standby mode. The surrounding Imperial mechanical troops rushed toward Master White Fan Manor at high speed, especially the shadows of the dozens of wolf fang mecha. They instantly cut through the air, turning into countless suffocating shadows that quickly closed in. Was this a mecha left for him? Sulu frowned in thought, but there was no time to think further. Stepping on the ground full of rubble and fallen branches of the green trees, he leapt high into the air like a giant bird returning to the forest. With a beautiful flip in the air, he dove into this ownerless wolf fang mech with a whoosh. His back slammed heavily into the seat, causing a sharp pain in those broken bones. His face was pale, but he didn't even make a sound. His fingers quickly swept across the touch screen, and his left hand pulled on the control stick, quickly pressing the quick trigger button below the stick as fast as lightning, completing his first action. The cockpit door of the wolf fang mecha was forcefully closed, and the hydraulic valves started to creak because of the overload operation. The cannon on the left mechanical arm popped out with a clang. Almost at the same time, the heavy body of the mecha suddenly sank, and the micro-engine at the mechanical knee joint started to hum loudly. Whoosh! A loud and low roar, accompanied by the sound of soil being flipped up, caused the wolf fang mecha hidden in the dense forest to bounce horizontally, dodging two long-range missiles that had just been shot at it. The violent explosion was completely unable to damage the wolf fang mecha at all. With a calm expression, Sulu entered the control order and rushed toward the three Imperial mecha charging at him at high speed. With a flash of lightning, the wolf fang mecha he was controlling instantly accelerated, dragging a few dazzling afterimages behind it, and viciously kicked the stomach of the Imperial mecha charging at the front. At the same time, the sharp spike on the right mechanical arm popped out from under the left mechanical arm, and mysteriously pierced into the cockpit of the second Imperial mecha. Having received White Caoshi's warning, the first three Imperial mecha to rush over to intercept Sulu were all the most elite pilots of the Empire. Their reactions could not be said to be slow, and the triangular formation they had adopted was also very tight, but unfortunately, just like that sentence that had been repeated countless times in countless novels, the one they had encountered was Sulu. The huge spike on the right mechanical arm was still flashing with terrifying electricity in the Imperial mecha's cockpit. The Imperial mecha that had been kicked away was still retreating pathetically in the air, forcibly adjusting its balance and twisting its entire body in a strange manner. Sulu controlled the left cannon of the wolf fang mecha to open fire. With a simple and direct sound, the bright light of the fire illuminated the dark morning, and the last Imperial mecha was directly blasted to the ground. As this Imperial mecha fell heavily to the ground, the Imperial pilot in the cockpit still could not understand. In such a short distance, how did Sulu dare to open fire? Could it be that he was not afraid of the sputtering shrapnel, not afraid of the violent explosion after the mecha was destroyed? The people of the Empire still did not understand Sulu well enough. Perhaps Hui Chaoshu did, but as the strongest mecha fighter in the universe, she was still within the walls of the courtyard at this moment, looking at the mecha before her with a cold and solemn expression, not yet able to board the cockpit in time. For people like Sulu, Mad Manly, and Hui Chaoshu, as long as they were allowed to enter the mecha, they could do many unimaginable and crazy things. Even if Sulu did not have the simulation system to help him control the mecha right now, when his left hand gripped the cold control stick, his right hand gently stroking the smooth touch screen, as he sat in the stuffy cockpit, feeling the powerful vibrations of the heavy metal body beneath him, endless self-confidence and desire for battle would surge into his body, making him stronger than usual, so strong that it would be difficult to defeat him. In the instant that the autocannons fired, the Wolf Fang mecha he was operating retreated at an incredible speed, nimbly escaping the range of the shrapnel. Then, it turned into a gust of wind, retreating in an eerie manner. It broke 3 thin trees, half of the collapsed wall, and fled westward. Chi Dabing was on a small building in the distance, holding an electronic telescope, calmly and coldly observing all of this. The organization's forged royal secret order could not fool the military for too long, so he had to disappear early. However, for some reason, he did not leave immediately, instead staying nearby to watch the mecha he had specifically left behind. He wanted to know what the organization wanted to do. When he saw that figure leap over the courtyard wall, he roughly understood the military's nervousness and the organization's intentions. However, as he did not have any good feelings towards the people of the Federation, he subconsciously wanted to see that guy die. Of course, a Wolf Fang mecha could not fight against a heavy mechanical army. He had been hiding in the Royal Special Forces for many years, so he was very clear about the combat strength of the elite troops outside Master Fan's manor. Therefore, he could not help but feel that the organization's arrangement was a bit ridiculous. He held on to the electronic telescope, watching the Dynasty mecha charging over at high speed like a cloud of dust. A cold and disdainful smile appeared on his lips, and he began to sympathize with the fate of that Federation person. However, what happened next made him tighten his grip on the telescope uncontrollably. An angry scream rang out in Master Fan's manor, and an intense mecha battle suddenly erupted between the ruins and the overgrown trees. In an instant, who knew how many bullets rained down, and how many sparks lit up the surroundings. However, amidst the rain of bullets and sparks, the figure of that Wolf Fang mecha did not fall. It was as sharp as before, fierce and persistent. Chi Dabing put down his binoculars with mixed feelings. The image of the Wolf Fang mech in battle still seemed to be stuck in his vision. He sighed heavily in his heart. That Federation person who had tried to snatch his way away was actually such a fierce man. It looked like that person really did have a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding. He furrowed his gloomy eyebrows, tidied up everything in the room, and walked down the old wooden stairs into the dark underground passage. He walked towards the contact point that the organization had designated. Chapter 638. In the cockpit, Hui Chaoshu looked through the surveillance screen at the explosions in the distance. She looked at the figure of the mecha that was fighting fiercely between the morning light and the flames. It was as unfathomable as a ghost and as unstoppable as a warrior. Her expression was still very calm as she sent clear orders to all of her subordinates in the system. She had never wanted to kill a person as much as she did at this moment. If Sulu really managed to escape, how furious would her father be? How great of a loss would the Empire suffer because of this? However, she was not worried that Su Lu would be able to fight his way out of the encirclement. Against the heavy mechanical troops that the Empire had prepared for a long time, a single mecha was definitely not invincible. Furthermore, those traitors who dared to forge His Majesty's orders were most likely the trash of the civilian resistance organization. How could they possibly be able to stop the Empire's iron hooves? Furthermore, she was already seated in her mecha and was about to give chase. The intense battle caused black clouds of smoke to erupt from time to time. The mecha groups on the Empire's side were completely unable to stop him, and the densely packed war chariots were even more unable to catch sight of his figure. The whistling rain of bullets from the fighter jets also often only hit the dust caused by the heavy mechanical feet on the ground. The citizens of the Empire who were watching from the street corners in the distance screamed and fled in all directions. No one knew whether those flying rocks and blind bullets would hit their chests in the next instant. Su Lu controlled the Wolf Fang mecha and ran madly through the streets of the slums. He ran again, ran to the west, and then retreated to the east. In front of him were the black muzzles of cannons, and behind him were the mecha groups that had gathered as if they were facing a great enemy. The whistling fighter jets swept past in midair, and there were enemies everywhere. Even though he had previously successfully taken a path, the end of the path had been sealed off again. Fortunately, the surroundings of the Great Master Fan Manor were the largest slums on Tianjing planet. An area of more than 10 square kilometers had been cleared out by the imperial armies, and there were countless densely packed houses outside. Millions of people at the bottom of society lived here. Even though the Empire's royal family could treat these people like pigs and dogs, in the end, they still did not dare to use weapons of mass destruction to destroy these people along with the Wolf Fang mecha. That was why Su Lu had the opportunity to run around in a seemingly confident and arrogant manner. The guns and cannons on the mechanical arms of the mechanical suit spat out beautiful flames. The Wolf Fang mechanical suit was like a hurricane, mercilessly tearing apart the obstacles in front of it. However, it was unable to control the dense imperial heavy mechanical army, and the encirclement became smaller and smaller. The dim light in the cockpit shone on Su Li's expressionless face. Ever since he forcefully broke through the space tunnel and assassinated Countess Chaoshi, his life seemed to have become one of constant running and escaping. He was no stranger to this kind of tense atmosphere. However, whether it was Zhang Shuhai and Huai Caoshi's escape, or the difficult escape that night under the lake, none of them seemed to be as tense as the situation in front of him. Facing dozens of the dynasty's newest mechanical suits, hundreds of heavy armored vehicles, roaring fighter jets, and more than 10,000 elite soldiers of the dynasty, escaping seemed to have become an impossible mission. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that he was extremely familiar with the mechanical structure and firepower of the Wolf Fang mechanical suit in Zhang Shuhai's conversation with Huai Caoshi, the mechanical suit under him would have collapsed long ago. What made him even more nervous was that he could clearly see on the radar screen that there was a seemingly normal Wolf Fang mechanical suit moving at a high speed behind him. With just one look, he could confirm that the one inside the mechanical suit that was moving forward in a straight line in the morning sky was definitely Huai Caoshi. If that bitch gets here, I'm not going to live. Su Lu cursed in his heart, somewhat frustrated that Huai Caoshi's heavy leg injury had no effect on her mecha operation. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the puddle of smelly water behind the residential building in front of him. Gritting his teeth, he pushed the control stick forward, pushing the speed of the Wolf Fang mechanical suit to the limit, and charged over with a boom. Just as the Wolf Fang mechanical suit was about to enter the puddle of smelly water, a dense hail of bullets finally struck its tough body. The most lethal of all was a high-speed cruising electromagnetic missile fired by a fighter jet in the sky. Amidst the dust and sparks of the bullet hitting the tough alloy armor, that electromagnetic missile came from the sky, striking the side of the Wolf Fang mechanical suit viciously with a whoosh. Hundreds of graphite lines glowing with faint blue electrical arcs shot out in an instant, wrapping around the Wolf Fang mechanical suit like a tightly woven fishnet. A series of strange metallic sounds rang out, and the sprinting Wolf Fang mechanical suit abruptly froze in midair. Dozens of micro-engines exploded at the same time, and the system was put under a huge load in an extremely short amount of time. Temporarily losing control, the mecha plummeted pathetically into the puddle. The giant mecha that had fallen into the puddle immediately exploded violently. The power of the explosion stirred up a large amount of black and gray sewage, filling the air with a foul stench. A few small shrimps with mud clinging to their limbs leapt into the bushes by the shore, quickly disappearing without a trace. The normal Wolf Fang mechanical suit at the back of the encirclement came slashing over like a sharp blade, but it was still one step too late. It only had time to see Su Li's mecha plummet pitifully into the lake, and then that explosion. The Imperial troops that had rushed to the edge of the puddle began to madly fire bullets at the surface of the water. The rain of bullets made the morning sky turn somewhat red, and steam actually began to rise from the small puddle of water. The cockpit door of the indifferent Wolf Fang mechanical suit by the shore slowly opened, and Huai Chaosher walked out of the cockpit, arriving at the edge of the puddle. Her expressionless face was slightly furrowed, and she stared silently at the chaotic surface of the water. "Your Highness, that person is dead for sure." An Imperial colonel with a face full of mud ran to her side and reported that Wolf Fang mechanical suit was hit countless times. With such a violent explosion, there is no way he could have survived. This high-ranking officer knew very well what Her Highness was most concerned about right now, so his report was exceptionally concise and certain. Unfortunately, Huai Caosher's expression did not improve in the slightest because of his confirmation. She stared coldly at the surface of the lake, the wings of her nose twitching slightly, as if she was very disgusted by the foul stench of mud here. "No, he is not dead." Huai Chaosher was silent for a moment, and then opened her mouth to say in a heavy voice, "This Federation person often appears to be hot-blooded and impulsive, but in reality, everything he does is carefully planned and prepared. Colonel Shadow, a puddle of water in the slums is actually deep enough to swallow a 6-meter-tall Wolf Fang mechanical suit. Don't you think this is very strange?" The expression of the Imperial officer named Shadow beside her changed greatly, and he looked at the surface of the lake in disbelief. He thought to himself, "I saw that mechanical suit explode with my own eyes, so why does Her Highness still insist that this Federation person is still alive? Drain this puddle of water." Huai Chaosher said slowly, "Seal all entrances. Also, I really want to know who left a Wolf Fang mechanical suit for him." "Yes, Your Highness." The officer saluted with a serious expression. What happened later confirmed Huai Caosher's judgment. After the Imperial troops deployed large engineering mechas to drain the puddle of water, they found tons of stinking household garbage in the muddy pond. They hung up the remains of the mechanical suit that had exploded, and they even dug up several large boxes of heavy weapons that were secretly hidden by a famous gang in Tianjing Planet's underground world. However, they did not find Su Li's body. In reality, the Imperial troops found a total of 17 corpses in the puddle of water after it was drained. It was just that these highly decomposed corpses were clearly the victims of unsolved murder cases in the past. The metal balls tied to their skeletal ankles indicated that their identities had nothing to do with Su Li. Huai Chaosher did not stay by the puddle of water to wait for the results, because she knew very well that a person like Su Li would not die so easily. However, she did not return to the palace, nor did she rush to the hospital to treat her injuries. Instead, she walked back to the white courtyard with a lonely expression. An entire battalion of soldiers surrounded the Great Master Fan Manor. The heavy firepower that made one tremble with fear was aimed at the courtyard, and it could be destroyed at any time, turning it into a historical relic. With the blood oath between the Baijin royal family and the Great Master Fan Manor, without the Emperor's personal order, even the craziest soldier would not dare to act rashly. Even if this generation's crazy great teacher had done such a crazy thing, not a single soldier dared to walk into the completely defenseless Great Master Fan Manor. Even Huai Chaosher had sat in the mechanical suit at the entrance of the Great Master Fan Manor. The white courtyard was quiet and serene, as if the madness of the past few days and nights, as well as the fierce battle outside the courtyard, had not affected this place at all. Huai Chaoshi walked to the two green trees, clasped her hands behind her back, and looked up at the sky. Her face that could barely be described as handsome was filled with an unsuppressible gloom. Her eyes, which were narrowed like a crescent moon, seemed to be able to shoot out angry raindrops in the blink of an eye. The naked great teacher was still hanging upside down in the air, his face flushed. It was unknown whether it was because of his blood pressure, or because of the embarrassment of having his precious buttocks and private parts seen by his niece. Huai Chaoshi did not put him down. She narrowed her eyes in silence for a long time, and then asked very seriously, "Just now, did that person come back?" Su Lu was like a cheerful gopher, crawling, running, and crawling in the dark underground water channel. His body was covered in mud and even more disgusting old ruins, but his expression was extremely cheerful, as if he could not help but laugh out loud in the dark underground water channel. To be able to escape and survive like this, of course, it was worth a good laugh. He looked at the light screen of the map on his bracelet, and his thoughts ran quickly, trying to find the most reasonable way. He was too familiar with this slum area that he had lived in for almost a year, even more so than the people of the empire. He knew where the smelly pond led to, and he had the map of Tianjing planet's underground water channel in his hands. More importantly, his temperament determined that he had to have a plan before he had ambitions. It was just that there were many unexpected key links in today's plan. Thinking of this, he could not help but narrow his eyes. Those people who had helped him, who exactly were they? Chapter 639. The most powerful life form in the universe was a crustacean called the cockroach, and Su Li's life form had always been as powerful as the cockroaches. The most powerful life form in the universe that was closest to humans was the rat. Su Lu, who was crawling in the dark underground tunnel with a silly smile on his face, really looked like a big rat with black mud all over its fur. Therefore, even if he was alone in the empire, facing the pursuit of countless elite troops, he could still live well and run with all his might. However, running always required a goal, and his goal was undoubtedly to return to the Federation, to return to his hometown. Originally, he had pinned all his hopes on the possible spaceship in Master Fan's mansion, as well as a certain spaceship that might exist that surpassed the current level of technology. Unfortunately, these somewhat illusory hopes were all torn to pieces by the crazy artistic middle-aged man, and he even almost lost his life because of it. The illusory hope no longer existed, so how could he go home? Where should he go now? He stopped by a wet sewage treatment pipe and leaned against the mossy wall. After sitting down, he temporarily relaxed, so that the bones in his body that were broken by Huai Caoshi's fists began to express the greatest protest with pain. Even with his terrifying tolerance, he could not help but breathe rapidly for a while before he resisted the urge to groan and let his blurred vision refocus. He definitely could not go back to Aunt Susan's small courtyard. Since the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency had already investigated there, going back was tantamount to suicide. What made Su Lu even more worried was whether Huai Chaoshi would abide by the non-binding secret room agreement between the two of them and let go of the kind mother and son. His gaze fell on the note in his pocket. Under the dim light, Su Lu once again carefully read the few lines of the Empire's words and a sketch on the note. He fell into deep thought. He knew that this note, which was obviously hastily written and thus appeared to be very unserious, actually represented a key to a door that led to a certain mysterious force within the Empire. But the problem was, until now, Su Lu still did not understand the origin of the mysterious force within the Empire. Were they nobles or commoner rebels? What was their purpose in helping him? According to the Federation government's long-distance analysis of the thoughts of the people of the Empire, it seemed that there wasn't a single class in the Empire that had even the slightest favorable impression of the Federation. What made him even more alarmed was that in the incident at Great Master Fan Manor, this mysterious power was too strong, so strong that he did not dare to believe it. Under the heavy encirclement of countless imperial troops, that mysterious faction was actually able to silently enter the Great Master Fan Manor and subdue that seemingly insane but definitely not simple Great Teacher without alerting anyone. Then, that mysterious faction was actually able to leave behind a wolf Fang mech and create a crack in the tight imperial encirclement. According to Su Li's historical knowledge and analysis, it was impossible for such a strong opposition force to appear in an empire like the Bai Yan dynasty. It should be known that the prince had participated in the rebellion of the nobles last year. In the end, under the terrifying dictatorship of the empire, he could only end up with a pitiful ending. There were still many unanswered questions. If that mysterious faction was really standing on the opposite side of the imperial family, why didn't they kill Huai Chaoshu back then? Why didn't they even help him kill Huai Chaoshu? Why didn't they kill the Great Teacher, instead using such a childish method to hang Great Master Fan naked? Great Master Fan imprisoned him and Huai Chaoshu in the end so that they could sleep together naked. The person who made the Great Teacher become a pitiful man hanging upside down, this method of dealing with it, seemed more like a mockery and revenge for the Great Teacher's crazy attempt. Yes, it was revenge. Revenge from the standpoint of himself and Huai Chaoshu. In the dark underground waterway, Su Li's narrowed eyes flashed with a ray of light, which quickly disappeared. He closed his eyes and recalled all the details he had experienced since he started to escape last year, especially when he escaped from Maple Lake. It was as if there was a pair of eyes watching him, watching his back, some kind of unbelievable conjecture, some kind of reality that he had been anticipating, gradually took shape in his mind. Because of the shock brought by this conjecture, he closed his eyes tighter and tighter until his straight eyebrows were knitted together and his shoulders were trembling slightly. 3 days later. The incomparably terrifying incident that shocked the entire Tianjing planet, especially the millions of citizens in the slums, had quietly come to an end. Perhaps the secret agents of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau were still dutifully investigating every clue, and there were countless armed soldiers carrying out strict checks on the main roads outside the slums. However, to the bottom-level citizens who lived in this long and run-down street, their hearts were numb from years of torment, and there were no longer many ripples in their hearts. For them, that terrifying incident was, at most, a topic of conversation after dinner. Life still had to go on. Those poor people who lived around the Great Master Fan Manor wiped away their tears after receiving the extremely meager allowance. They began to expressionlessly collect the bits and pieces of furniture in their homes and the few valuable items buried in the soil from the ruins of their homes. A young man with a pale face, thin body, and sparse eyebrows walked out of a smoke-filled casino. His footsteps were staggering, and his eyes were lifeless. He did not attract anyone's attention. To the citizens of the slums who were busy making a living, a gambling addict like him who spent day and night in the casino and could die on the streets at any time was not worth wasting a second to look at or sympathize with. This young man spoke with an authentic southern prefectural accent and awkwardly tried to get close to the street vendors selling breakfast. In the end, he was still unable to get a few bites of food. He could not help but have a resentful expression on his face as he muttered dirty words under his breath. He put his hands into his pockets and walked shakily toward the side of the alley. This annoying gambling addict was Su Lu. Although he did not manage to get a hot meal from the vendor, at least he confirmed that he did not come to the wrong place. The address left on the slip of paper was an inconspicuous, run-down courtyard in the alley. After successfully escaping from the stinking pond, he did not think of a way to leave the capital full of soldiers. Instead, he chose to continue to stay in the slums. It seemed to be a risky choice, but in fact, he had thought it through carefully. He was not familiar with the other places in the empire, and this area, which was crowded with millions of slums, criminals, prostitutes, and thieves, could really cover him. From a certain point of view, he was more like a member of the slums than those imperial soldiers who were chasing him. That day in the underground tunnel did not last long. Su Lu had always been a person who was good at simplifying complicated problems. Since there was no road in front of him, and the mysterious force left a road, then it was good to simply walk on it. No matter how dangerous the conspiracy was, it would not be as terrible as the anger of the imperial family. Not to mention that the conjecture hidden deep in his heart also needed to be confirmed by contacting the mysterious force. After gently knocking on the door of the sleeping courtyard, after a moment, an expressionless middle-aged woman led him in. Looking at the woman who did not seem to welcome him, Sulu naturally thought of Aunt Susan. There was no identity confirmation, no inspection, and no secret signal. Sulu was led into the depths of the rundown courtyard. He even wondered if the other party knew who he was. Oh, this was not a philosophical question, but a logical question. Deep in the rundown courtyard was an open space, surrounded by randomly built wooden houses, which were very good at blocking the prying eyes of the people outside the courtyard. And the car parts and repair tools placed in the middle of the space were probably able to successfully hide from the detection of the Intelligence Bureau's satellites. Outside the wooden house in the front right was a row of simple factories. From time to time, the sound of motors rotating could be heard, but because it was still early, the sound was not dense. After observing up to this point, Sulu could already confirm that this was a stronghold that used the car repair shop as a cover. But he still did not know who the owner of this stronghold was. The scene in the living room on the first floor suddenly changed. More than a dozen shirtless big men stared at Sulu, who walked in, with unfriendly expressions. These big men were burly and muscular, and their hands were constantly fiddling with heavy firepower firearms that were obviously prohibited. What was even more alarming was the dangerous aura that these people exuded, a fanatical aura that did not take human life seriously. What Sulu cared about was the emotions that these people revealed in their eyes. Disgust, contempt, mockery, cruelty. He was very familiar with these emotions. On the battlefield in the West Woods, he could often see the Empire's soldiers casting the same look at the people of the Federation. It seems that you are very clear about my identity. He stood in the middle of the room and said, and you don't seem to welcome me. But to be honest, no matter where you come from, or how you want to cooperate with me, I don't have high hopes for you. At this moment, the man who had been sitting in the chair with his back to him smiled and said, don't worry about our discipline. Although everyone, including me, hates the people of the Federation very much, they are my brothers. Without my permission, no one here will betray you. The man stood up and looked at Sulu with a smile. He continued, also, you don't have to worry about your safety here. As the biggest gang leader in this district, in fact, this slum area is managed by me, and not His Majesty the Emperor. Sulu was silent for a moment before he shrugged and replied, gang leader. This is somewhat unexpected. It seems that the person who wants to talk to me should be someone else, someone above you. Chapter 640. Standing in front of him was a man who claimed to be the underworld emperor of the slums. He was wearing an expensive fur coat, but the upper half of his body was completely naked under the coat. The silky smooth fur and tattooed skin intertwined with each other. Between his eyebrows, there was a hint of coldness and a sense of cruelty hidden deep within. It was very successful in not making those gentle and polite words seem out of place with his identity. There was a dark underworld on both sides of the universe. Sulu, who was born as an orphan in Donglin, was no stranger to the rules of this world. He was clear that in this seemingly bottommost underworld, there would often be some extremely powerful people, and Lin Banshan was one of the most famous representatives. Even in the Federation, which had the protection of the glory of the Charter, no one dared to completely ignore the underworld. Furthermore, this was the Empire's Tianjing planet, the most chaotic and lawless slum. Logically speaking, he should be more polite to this man, but he really wanted to see the person above this person, so his answer was extremely direct and simple, which made him seem a little conflicted and lacking in respect. In the eyes of the burly men holding guns in the living room, Su Li's answer was not only lacking in respect, but also seriously impolite. These men at the bottom of the Empire's hierarchy did not have the slightest good impression of the Federation people. At this moment, they could not help but stand up and curse loudly. They raised the heavy guns in their hands and pointed them at Su Li's head, as if they were about to fire in anger at the next moment. The smile on the face of the underworld leader wearing the fur coat gradually disappeared. His right hand, which was wearing 3 extraordinarily large diamond rings, slowly reached into his collar and gently rubbed the soft and smooth fur and the skin of his chest. Then, he shook his head. He did not stop these loyal and bloodthirsty subordinates from impulsively beating up the Federation people. He only reminded them not to use guns and to use some simple violence to let the other party know what was called a heart of respect. The reason he made such a decision was because he was extremely curious. Why did the old man he respected the most value this fugitive from the Federation so much? What kind of confidence did this outlander, who appeared to be the calmest in front of him for the past 5 years, have? Many years ago, on Eastwood Planet, Sulu had a cold gun barrel pointed at his forehead. He had never forgotten that painful, cold, and humiliating feeling. After so many years, he had experienced being pointed at by a gun so many times that he was almost numb. His calm heart could not produce too much tension. A burly man over 2 meters tall, with a face full of thick brown beard, threw the gun in his hand to his companion. He grinned and revealed an innocent yet cruel smile as he walked towards Sulu. He rubbed his hands, and the joints of his upper body made cracking sounds that made people's hearts palpitate. It was unknown what kind of terrifying strength was hidden in his tight and protruding muscles. When the armed bandits in the living room saw this scene, they could not help but shrug at the same time. They guessed that this thin and pale Federation person would probably be able to hold on for a few seconds. After that, a few bones would be broken. Sulu slightly tilted his head and narrowed his eyes at the burly man who was getting closer and closer. Then, he frowned. He could tell that the other party would definitely not be satisfied if he did not break a few of his bones. However, too many of his bones had been broken by Huai Chaoshi. It was impossible for him to fully recover after 3 days of recuperation in the dark sewers. He absolutely did not have the thought of breaking another bone to comfort the mood of these Empire gangsters. The burly man grinned, revealing a mouth full of yellow teeth that were as big as corn grains. Several traces of malevolence and cruelty flashed in his eyes that were as round as the mouth of a bottle. He raised his right arm and slapped towards Su Li's head with a whoosh. It was a very simple slap, without any fancy movements. This burly man, as the #1 warrior of this gang, had absolute confidence in his own strength. He believed that this slap would make Sulu fall to the ground no matter how he tried to block it. Who told him to have a terrifying palm that was even bigger than a small table? Looking at the malevolent and cruel expression in the pair of round eyes, Su Li's eyes narrowed even more. He unexpectedly remembered that when he fought with his teammates on the battlefield in the West Woods, he could always see a very similar primitive and savage bloodthirsty impulse in the eyes of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. This feeling was very bad, and it made him very unhappy. His left arm, which was barely able to lift up, was lifted up casually right before the palm that was as big as a small table was about to hit him. His left thumb and index finger locked onto the burly man's wrist at lightning speed, and his fingertips sank deep into the 2 cartilages of his wrist. With such a simple grab, the burly man's attack that was full of brute force suddenly stopped in the air. His thick right arm was stiff in the air, and there was no way for him to move an inch further. The expressions of the Imperial gangsters in the living room changed dramatically. They stood up in shock and subconsciously tightened their grip on the guns in their hands. Sulu silently looked at the shock and unwillingness in the eyes of the burly man in front of him. His shaved eyebrows slightly wrinkled, and he put more strength into his fingertips. His thumb sank a little deeper, like a nail deeply inserted into a piece of wood, and there was no way to pull it out. A stream of blood slowly flowed out from the deep hole. The burly man only felt a sharp pain, and the strength he was usually extremely proud of seemed to have been completely drained at this moment. His right arm, which had killed countless enemies, was actually fixed in the air by 2 fingers of this skinny guy. The gangsters were all fugitives who had fought between life and death. Knowing that he had met a tough opponent, the burly man did not have the slightest fear. Instead, the most primitive and savage fierceness in his heart was aroused. He howled like a beast in pain and pulled back his right arm with all his strength. Su Li's 2 fingers were like 2 iron nails. How could he pull back? The burly man should have expected this in advance, but no one would have thought that the brute force resistance was only a facade. His empty left hand reached behind his waist and grabbed the handle of the alloy military knife. What was more dangerous was that he suddenly exerted strength in his waist, preparing to lift up his thigh that was thicker than a child's waist. Even if Su Lu could block the sinister attack of the military knife, there was no way he could block this furious kick to his lower abdomen. Su Li's bones were broken, and his lower abdomen was also heavily injured. He was extremely angry that these imperial people once again attacked these places. It had to be known that his injuries were bestowed upon him by that insufferably arrogant highness. What qualifications did these gangsters have to follow in White Saosher's footsteps? With a flip of his wrist, he valiantly twisted the burly man's arm. His 2 undamaged feet strangely jumped below. The posture that was deeply rooted in his bones and muscles perfectly appeared on the scene. The moment the burly man was about to lift his leg, his left foot had already moved first. It was extremely precise, and it ruthlessly stomped down without reason. The left foot that was wearing a hard-bottom leather boot fiercely stomped down on the back of the burly man's right foot. It was as if a large iron hammer was ruthlessly smashing down on a flour plate. A clear and terrifying sound of bones breaking erupted from below. The burly man's complexion immediately became pale. His mouth opened wide, and a cry of pain sounded from between his large yellow teeth. Su Lu didn't have the desire to listen to a burly man scream like a woman. Immediately after, his body moved forward again, and his knee fiercely struck the burly man's knee joint. Almost at the same time, his body strangely made a similar movement in the air. His right leg drew an arc diagonally outwards, and as fast as lightning, it struck the burly man's waist. The front knee directly deformed the burly man's knee joint, and it terrifyingly twisted backwards. The back knee accurately struck the burly man's right hand that was holding the military knife. The tremendous force caused blood to instantly spurt out from the tiger's mouth. The 3 precise, fast, and ruthless attacks at close range didn't give the burly man any chance to cry out in pain. The powerful lethality and the overlapping waves of pain made this person fall heavily to the ground like a small mountain. The impact made the floor of the living room tremble slightly, and then he fell unconscious. All of this happened too quickly. The gangsters in the living room didn't have time to react or rescue at all. They could only watch with wide eyes as that thin youth from the Federation moved forward like a demon, leaping sideways and turning his companion into an unconscious lump of meat. What made them feel incomparably terrified was that this Federation youth's close-range combat skills were so powerful that they couldn't find any words to describe them. It was clearly a very simple movement, but it contained such inconceivable power. These movements clearly didn't seem fast, and they were extremely clear, but they always gave people a feeling that they couldn't keep up with his rhythm. Many guns were raised again, and they aimed at Su Lu. However, at this time, these gangsters' hands were slightly trembling, and they couldn't be as relaxed and contemptuous as before. They kept feeling that even if they opened fire immediately, they might not be able to kill this Federation youth who was quietly standing in the living room. It was because he was too quiet. Su Lu slowly retracted his left foot. He didn't look at the burly man's instep that was rapidly swelling like a rotting cake. He withdrew his gaze and quietly looked at the leader of these people, the man who called himself the Emperor of the Empire's gangsters. The building was deathly silent. After a long period of silence, the naked man wearing a fur coat frowned, lit a cigarette, and said, "My name is Muen." All of us here are my brothers. We don't have the slightest good impression of the Federation people, but we live in a world where the strong preys on the weak. Your performance just now should be qualified to win our respect. Mr. Muen, hello, Su said. I still really want to meet the person above you. There was someone upstairs, and there was always someone upstairs. A blurry face appeared in the shadows of the second floor. Muen followed Su Li's gaze and looked upstairs. When he saw that face nod, he couldn't help but frown and make an inviting gesture. My name is Voss. I'm currently leading the underground resistance. From the day I was born, my life's mission was to lead the oppressed and bullied lowly and commoners to use all means possible to resist the bloody rule of the Empire's emperor, to overthrow this backward government formed by warmongering maniacs and shameless nobles, and to seek a more free, peaceful, and prosperous future for the 4 billion people in the 47 star systems of the left sky star region. In the past 20 years, our cause has suffered unprecedented setbacks. Millions of brave warriors, armed with crude weapons, resisted the royal family's battleships, cannons, and mechas, but after paying a price as high as a river of blood, we still couldn't find any hope of success. Until your appearance. In the dark room on the second floor, the thin old man sitting on the high back chair slowly turned around. The wrinkles and yellow-brown spots on his face made his originally white skin look extremely ugly. Chapter 641. Maybe it was because of the spots on his face and his pale skin that he didn't want to see people, or maybe it was because of the age that made the old man afraid of the wind and the light. There was only one dim light in the quiet room on the second floor, giving off a gloomy and rainy feeling. When the old man appeared in front of him, Sulu wasn't too excited. Instead, he was slightly disappointed, even if the old man was the leader of the Empire's underground resistance organization, Voss. Because the old man might be the person he was looking for, but he might not be the person he was looking for. This sounded a little complicated, but it was actually very simple. He now needed the help of a force that could help him escape from the Empire. The underground resistance organization was undoubtedly one of the best choices, but this leader of the resistance organization with spots on his face was not that person. But when the old leader of the resistance organization in front of him said this sentence, Su Li's expression didn't change, but his heart was fiercely shaken. Until you appeared. This kind of sentence usually appeared in mythological scripts. The human who endured humiliation and resisted the evil forces experienced countless calamities and finally found a young man with a strange bone next to a garbage dump. Holy light fell from the sky, shrouding the young man's fresh, refined, and radiant face. Graceful and sacred music sounded, and white doves flew in the sky. The old man holding a crutch cried and said in a trembling voice, I thought there was no hope for the human race, until you appeared in front of us sinners. Sulu couldn't help coughing violently, and his unhealed abdomen throbbed with pain. Tens of billions of people at the bottom of the Empire's resistance to overthrow the Empire's rule, what did it have to do with him? He was very clear about his own ability. He was not Li Pifu. Even if he was the Federation's military god Li Pifu, he was afraid that at most, he could only destroy the Empire's dynasty. So he didn't understand what the old leader wanted to say, so he kept silent and listened quietly. The Empire's royal family, on the one hand, used butchers like Keaton to carry out bloody massacres to suppress, on the other hand, they hypocritically made some improvements to buy people's hearts, such as the classless education plan on Liban Star. I have to admit that Emperor Fuchai is an excellent ruler. However, as an emperor, he represents the collective will of the royal family and the great nobles. Even if there are some internal conflicts between them because of these improvements, this objective fact cannot be changed. Improvement is alms. It is to reward the slaves with a few bowls of food so that they can work more efficiently and actively for the slave master. But the slaves are still slaves. The only difference is whether they can eat enough. I know that there is a sentence in the Federation's charter that all men are equal. Although I don't have any good feelings for you invaders, I have to admit that this sentence is very powerful. Perhaps this sentence is common sense to you, but it is the goal that we strive for. I don't want to be a slave. Mu-en and the others don't want to be slaves either. No one wants to be born a slave. Leader Worth's expression became extremely solemn, and his mottled old face shone with the hot-blooded radiance of youth. When I was young, I didn't understand why those with white skin should be the lower class, and why those beautiful girls with black eyes were the nobles. This is the color that the Creator painted on our bodies. Can we rely on this to determine whether we are high or low? Su-lu listened silently, feeling the strong resentment in the old man's words. When he thought of the Federation, he couldn't help but feel a little emotional. There had never been such racial discrimination in the Federation. Even in the Tai dynasty, there had never been such an ugly phenomenon. Today, although most of the people in the Federation had black hair and black eyes, people with brown hair and purple eyes were not rare. However, they had never heard of discrimination. On the contrary, they were very popular in daily life and in love. No one is willing, so we have to have a revolution. Leader Worth continued in a powerful voice, only a revolution can re-establish order and fairly distribute resources. However, to achieve true fairness, Emperor Fuchai must make him and his ministers spit out all the wealth, sweat, and blood that they have exploited from the people at the bottom for countless years. For the dynasty, this is equivalent to suicide. A regime is like a biological body. It's natural to be afraid of death. Who would commit suicide? If the reforms are carried out to the end, the awakened people will demand more fairness and cross the bottom line of the royal family. I think our great Emperor Fuchai will definitely tear off his hypocritical mask of benevolence and reveal the ferocious beast's kiss. But this violent beast is now wearing an admirable coat of gentleness. Many people are confused, and the companions who insist on walking on the path of revolution are becoming fewer and fewer. The old man in the chair let out a deep and sad sigh. All these years, I have been thinking about how to walk on the path of revolution and how long we can walk on it. However, I found that the future is getting bleaker and bleaker. At least for our generation, we have lost all opportunities. His gaze fell on Su Li's body. The old man's somewhat cloudy eyes suddenly had a trace of extremely complicated emotions. This emotion had a trace of hope, 2 traces of shame, 3 traces of hesitation, and 4 traces of guilt. Even the age spots on his face began to dim and intertwine with light. I have only met one person from the Federation in my life. The old man looked at Su-lu quietly and said with great emotion, "You are the second. It is also because of your appearance that I discovered that there seems to be a new fork in the path of revolution. There seems to be a new possibility for the future of the left sky galaxy." After listening silently for a long time, when the topic involved himself, Su-lu finally broke the silence. After thinking for a moment, he said calmly, "This is the second time you have mentioned me. Perhaps I can vaguely guess what you and your resistance organization want to do through me. But have you ever thought that for the people of the Empire, even those lowly people you want to protect, cooperating with the Federation is betrayal?" Su-lu raised his head and looked into the old man's cloudy eyes seriously. "No matter how history develops, as long as you make this decision, in the history books of the left sky galaxy, you will forever be a traitor. Although I detest the title of the Empire, I have to admit that I am a person of the Empire." Leader Voss suddenly smiled. A dim light reflected from his eyes, carrying a relaxed and determined expression. For a person of the Empire to make the decision to cooperate with the Federation government is more difficult than you think. The old man slowly raised his right arm and said calmly, "It is very difficult to convince the soldiers downstairs to cooperate with you. But the real difficulty is convincing yourself." Su-lu often preached to himself in his heart as if he was talking to himself, so that he could walk more firmly on this difficult path of life. However, he really did not like to listen to others preaching to him. But for some reason, in this dark room today, listening to this old man who had been in charge of the underground resistance organization for God knows how many years, reminiscing about the past and talking about these political struggles, he did not feel too conflicted. Instead, he felt a little emotional. It was probably because this old man sitting in the chair, in a sense, was somewhat similar to him. In order to practice what he thought was right, he would do anything at all costs. "Just tell me your conditions," Sulu said after a moment of silence. Old Voss took out a paper document from the drawer with trembling hands and slowly pushed it in front of him. Sulu quickly skimmed through it under the dim light. Frowning slightly, he shook his head and said, "Weapons support, protection of the sea route." "Mr. Voss, I don't know if these conditions are too much, but they are definitely not something that a colonel like me can decide. If you can send me back, I will transfer this document to President Pabre. Also, I reckon that there will definitely be a closed-door discussion at the Parliament Hill. No, you have to agree to these conditions before we can discuss the follow-up details." In just a moment, the old and respectable leader of the resistance organization, who was full of a sense of martyrdom, turned into a cold and sober businessman. He stared into Su Li's eyes and said indifferently, "I didn't hesitate to become a traitor who is cursed by thousands of people. We, the brave soldiers, endured the humiliation to cooperate with you invaders. If you are not even willing to show this bit of sincerity, how can I accept it? First, we are not invaders. Second, you can choose not to cooperate with us." Sulu replied, "Third, you said that you have only met 2 people from the Federation in your life, so perhaps you don't really understand the way the Federation operates. Such an important cooperation agreement can't be decided by a colonel like me." "No, no, no." Old Voss waved his hand to stop Su Li's conversation and said with a playful smile, "Although I have not lived under the rule of a democratically elected government, I know very well that human society is always similar. Any procedural democracy and procedural justice can be abandoned as long as there are enough benefits. And what we are sending to the Federation is exactly enough benefits. As for the validity of the document that you, Colonel Sulu, sign, I am not worried." Voss extended a trembling finger and said slowly, "As President Pabre's trusted aide, the successor of war god Li Pifu, and an idol of the Federation. As long as you sign this agreement, there are probably not many politicians who would dare to find procedural problems to overturn it." Sulu was silent for a moment and said, "I can sign the agreement, but after returning to the Federation, I can also pretend that none of this happened." Old Voss smiled and looked at him. After a moment, he said leisurely, "I know all of your past files and those amazing stories. I know that you are not such a person." Sulu was speechless. Could it be that the word, "good person," was so obviously engraved on his forehead? He couldn't help but sigh and say, "Placing a secret agreement that may involve the lives of hundreds of millions of people on my personal moral integrity. Although I have to admit that I am a little proud, isn't this too childish?" Chapter 642. "I received some sort of promise," the old man replied. Sulu vaguely thought of something from this sentence and lowered his head in silence. "What we need the most now is ammunition and military training. The Federation definitely won't be willing to give us warships and mechas, so please provide us with enough firearms and ammunition." "How do you send them over?" "I think that's the biggest problem." Sulu raised his head and asked with a frown. "You've been on the run for a year, so it seems that you're not very clear about the current situation of the universe," the old man said. "Your army has already reached the Southwest Star System, and the entire space channel is under your complete control. Transporting ammunition and weapons isn't a difficult task." In Su Li's concept or impression, the Federation and the Empire were extremely distant existences separated by countless light years. Whether it was the 6.5 years in the membrane space or crossing the space channel, it made communication between the two sides very difficult. That was why he had such a question before. It was only when he heard Leader Worth's words that he remembered that his brave comrades had already fought their way over. In an instant, an inexplicable excitement and desire surged into his body. He could not wait to return to those guys, to return to that dangerous battlefield. It's best to control the smile on your lips, Worth said coldly. The smile of an invader is very dazzling. The old man tapped on a certain page in the document with a trembling finger and continued, also, I hope that your army won't enter this star system. My organization and I will definitely not allow you to really harvest our planet clean. This, I really can't promise, Sulu said very directly. Old Worth did not continue this topic. After a moment of silence, he said, then I ask that your army maintain enough calm on the occupied administrative planets and try not to harm civilians as much as possible. Okay. Sulu replied without the slightest hesitation. Then, he added, but the right to define the civilians and the army has to be decided by us. I can't let my colleagues make unnecessary sacrifices just to avoid accidentally hurting civilians of the Imperium. As for the location of military training, I think this smuggling interstellar passage is more suitable. The request for escorts mentioned in the document is actually two sides of the same coin with this matter. Our economic source is mainly dependent on this smuggling route. Speaking of the economy, I hope your government can provide generous material assistance. Remember, it's a material that can be easily exchanged. The Federation's currency is equivalent to waste paper in the Empire. Sulu patiently listened to the old man list out the conditions of the resistance organization one by one. In the end, his mood finally became a little strange. Pressing his right hand on the document, he frowned and asked, I only see our obligations. Where are our rights? What can you do? We will send you alive, back to your army, Voss looked into his eyes and said calmly. This is far from enough. Sulu looked into the old man's cloudy eyes and said seriously. We will provide you with information on the deployment of the Empire's direct troops, coordinate your relationship with the citizens of the occupied planets, and help maintain order on the various planets. Voss paused for a moment before replying with a smile. What he said were the most troublesome aspects for the federal forces after entering the Empire's star system. I doubt your abilities. Sulu looked downstairs and shook his head. I even doubt if the influence of the resistance organization you lead can extend beyond this slum. I was able to rescue you from Master Fan's manor. This is already proof of our ability. No, I don't believe you have the ability to do this at all. Sulu stared into his eyes and said, someone is helping you. Who is that person? The old man's cloudy eyes fell on the document, completely ignoring his somewhat impolite question. Do you want me to believe that you can break through the Empire's army's encirclement with just these unorganized and undisciplined thugs downstairs? The conditions you promised, coordination, security, intelligence. I don't believe you can do it. Even if all the underworld emperors in the Empire's star system are your most ardent supporters, it would still be the same. You underestimate our strength, and you seriously lack experience in administration. The old man slowly raised his head and looked at him. To maintain the security of the occupied planet, to intimidate the parents, wives, and children of those hot-blooded guerrillas, to search for the intelligence you need in the dark, there is no one more suitable than these underworld thugs. Sulu was silent. He found that although the old man's words seemed ridiculous, they actually made a lot of sense. He shook his head and asked, these underworld thugs commit all kinds of crimes by extortion and blackmail. If they can enjoy a rich and indulgent life, why would they follow you and risk their lives to resist the Emperor? Also, don't you worry that the resistance organization is filled with such ambitious people and butchers? That would be a very dangerous thing. In order to find the light in a dangerous and authoritarian society like the Empire, we must unite all the forces that can be united. Although Muan is engaged in many shady businesses and is a leader of the underworld feared and admired by many, he is a high-ranking officer of the organization. He and his gang are one of the most reliable armed forces of the resistance organization. Mu-en is the same as us, born as a lowly commoner. His entire family died under the butcher knives of the Empire's royal thieves, so we have never doubted his loyalty. It is because we have the same tragic experience and determination to change this world. Just like you are a member of the Federation. There is naturally no need to doubt your determination to return to the Federation. The old man's gaze suddenly became gentle. He smiled and said, "Speaking of this, I have to thank you on behalf of many of the Empire's citizens." "Thank me?" "You have lived on planet Tianjing for close to a year. Perhaps in your eyes, the conflict between the classes in the Empire has not intensified to the point of no return. However, that is because you have not had the chance to visit other planets, those planets that have been stained red by the blood of the lowly commoners." A cold flame danced in the old man's eyes. Planet Tianjing is the face of the Empire. His Majesty will naturally not allow too many bloody massacres to occur. On the planets where the lowly commoners dared to resist, His Majesty has never sheathed his butcher knife. Keaton is his biggest butcher knife. Tens of millions of rebels and innocent commoners have died under his bloody suppression, becoming a bargaining chip for his glorious promotion. These few years, Emperor Fuchai has given him the cold shoulder because he does not want to have too much to do with the blood in the hands of this butcher. Keaton died in your hands. Tens of millions of unwilling heads and their dying relatives will thank you for taking revenge for them. For example, Mu-en, whom you just met, his sister died under the iron hooves of Keaton's direct subordinates. Su-lu paused for a moment before explaining, "I am taking revenge for myself. When I killed Keaton, I did not think of this. But in the end, he still died in your hands." Old man Voss smiled and said, "Therefore, it is easier to convince the young people in the organization to come to an agreement with you. All right, I admit that you are an excellent persuader. I personally agree with this agreement." Su-lu said, "But I have been thinking about a problem. According to your political ideology and program, if the federal forces continue to penetrate deeper, and if the Empire's White Hibiscus dynasty is really destroyed, then you and I will definitely have an intense war again. But that is a matter for a very long time." Old man Voss did not hide anything in front of Su-lu and said simply, "You invaders are the second mountain placed in front of us. We have to topple one mountain first. As for your government officials, after receiving this agreement, they will definitely have a similar view. In the current historical stage, we can be friends. In the future historical stage, we will definitely be enemies. As for what the relationship between the Federation and the Empire will become in the more distant historical river, that will be left to the Creator to deal with." The old man in front of him kept switching between the three roles of the respected leader of the resistance organization, the cold businessman full of opportunistic spirit, and the philosopher with a nihilistic aura who used simple concepts to induce a complex future. This switch made Su-lu feel a little strange, and he always felt that this aura was very familiar. Naturally, he thought of Mr. Sher's uncle at the Double Moon Festival Ball, the most legendary figure in Green Dragon Mountain. He could not help but frown slightly as he smelled some kind of strange smell. The last question is a repetitive one. He looked at the old man in the chair and said, "Who on earth rescued me from Master Fan's manor?" "It was us." "I don't believe it." Because of the long years of war, Su-lu did not have a trace of affection for all the people of the Empire in the past, and he had no interest in the internal political struggles of the enemy country. After spending nearly a year in the slums of the capital of Tianjing, especially Aunt Susan and Paul in that warm little courtyard, his mentality gradually changed. Deep in his heart, he knew that the poor and free people of the lower class of the Empire rebelled against the rule of the royal family. From an emotional standpoint, he sympathized with those who were oppressed, but he still would not take the initiative to do anything. Just as Professor Lin had said, there was no such thing as reason in the universe. Naturally, there was no such thing as true fairness. As a citizen of the Federation, the first thing he had to protect was the Federation. He had to protect the things within the Federation that were worth protecting. The joys and sorrows of human beings may be interconnected. If the Federation and the Empire were all human beings, the Federation should also be able to clearly feel the sadness and joy of the Empire people. It was just that the snow in front of their own door had not been swept clean. Even if they saw the roof of their courtyard collapse, what could they do? The problem was that now the situation had taken a turn for the worse. He was already sitting under the crumbling roof of someone else's courtyard, and he had no choice but to join forces with the owner of this courtyard to work seriously in the wind and snow. Su sat on the second-floor balcony of the repair shop, looking at the dark mass of buildings in the slums of Tianjin with some emotion. Chapter 643. Before the majority of the troops fully passed through the space passage, there was definitely no one in the Federation government who would think of developing some kind of cooperative relationship with the Empire's underground resistance organization, because the necessary conditions were lacking. If an advisor made such a request, it would perhaps only be taken as a joke. Just as the leader of the resistance organization said, he had only met 2 people from the Federation in his life, and had even less knowledge of the government of that distant star region. The Federation was also unfamiliar with those resistance organizations of the lowly people who struggled to survive at the bottom of the Empire, as if they were passers-by in his previous life. But who would have thought that right now, this agreement that was impossible to exist in the past would become a reality step by step? When Su thought of this, the tip of his eyebrows couldn't help but furrow tightly. His palm slowly stroked the slightly cold railing of the second floor, and he felt an inexplicable sense of absurdity. That orphan who stared blankly at the red and gray sky in Donglin's Zhonglo Street and the mining pit a few years ago could actually have such a great impact on the world today. Of course, this kind of influence was relatively fake. He was only a colonel of the federal military, and he had no qualifications to sign such an important agreement. He just appeared at the right place at the right time and coincidentally met the right group of people in the resistance organization, and the resistance organization believed in his many representative identities, such as the successor of the war god, the president's trusted aide, and so on. In fact, if this agreement didn't have 100 benefits and no harm to the federal military, perhaps Su wouldn't have dared to promise anything. It was now summer, very late in the summer, and the sultry air was accumulating and fermenting in the dilapidated buildings all around, gradually giving birth to a moldy smell. He sat on the second floor and watched silently, thinking to himself how many poor people who couldn't get relief from the Empire would silently die of heatstroke. I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly 40 years, and if the new government succeeds in proposing in the future, my first proposal in the parliament will definitely be to tear down this entire slum. Damn it, I'm already sick of looking at it, so who would be willing to live here? A voice full of viciousness rang out beside Su Li's ears. He turned his head to look at the person and said, "If everything is torn down overnight, where are these people going to live? Besides, are you so sure that you can enter the parliament?" The person who came to his side was Muan. Su stayed in the repair shop for a few days and roughly understood the situation. The middle-aged man beside him, who was used to wearing fur clothes, was actually the leader of one of the strongest gangs in Tianjin planet. Although he had heard Mr. Worth's explanation that day, he still found it hard to understand why a big shot who owned more than 10 casinos and 23% of the land in the slums would be so passionate about the resistance organization's cause. "Where do you live?" Muan chewed on a stick of coarse tobacco with a hint of cruelty and excitement. He looked at the city under the red sun in the west and said, "There are many manors of nobles there, enough for hundreds of thousands of people to live in. Even if it's not enough, Your Majesty's huge palace can be used as a dormitory. As for myself, I've given up so much for the revolution and risked my life for so many years. Do you think I'm not qualified to be a councilman?" Muan sneered. "Revolution isn't a treat, and it can't be a simple reward based on merit." After these few days of interaction, Su knew that these people from the Empire's gangs weren't difficult to deal with. He smiled and said sarcastically, if Mr. Worth knew about your attitude, he would definitely call for a meeting to criticize you. At the mention of Mr. Worth's name, Muwen's expression suddenly became a little reserved, and he no longer had the domineering aura of a mafia boss. After a moment of silence, he looked at Sulu and said seriously, you should know that all my family members died in the hands of Keaton. I've never thanked you seriously. A good deed done unintentionally has no right to ask for any gratitude. Su Li's answer was also very serious. He then asked curiously, I don't understand. The weather is so hot now, so why do you keep wearing this fur coat? Many people have been curious about this question over the years, but other than Mr. Worth, you're the first person who dares to ask me in front of me. Muwen casually threw the half-burnt coarse tobacco into the pond downstairs and laughed a few times. After a moment of silence, he actually started to explain. When I was young, I knew that only aristocratic young masters could afford to wear expensive fur coats, but I wasn't envious. Poor children, who would be envious of something that didn't belong to them? In the end, one day, the young master's mink fur coat was cut by a pair of scissors. He thought that I was the one who did it, so he beat me up. Muwen didn't reveal the scars on his body to prove how unforgettable that beating was. Perhaps it was because of his years in the underworld that caused him to have countless scars on his body. However, from the coldness and cruelty in his eyes that had been washed away by time, one could roughly imagine what kind of inhumane treatment he had encountered when he was young. From that day onwards, I had a strong desire for all smooth fur clothing. After coming to Tianjing Planet, I had been hiding in this street to pass time. After killing someone for the gang and getting the first red mark, I bought a very beautiful light gray fox fur coat. After that, I kept killing people and started to have the right to order people to kill people. At the same time, I started to buy fur coats. 10 coats, 100 coats. Yes, I felt very good. No matter the weather or the situation, I would always wear it. If I didn't wear it for even a minute, my chest hair would furiously prick at me. Muwen's left hand reached into the open pocket of the fur coat and played with the dense body hair. He couldn't help but laugh loudly. He laughed so hard that tears appeared in his eagle-like eyes. His smile gradually disappeared, and this underworld boss said indifferently, I know it seems crazy to you. Back then, the other bosses in the city used this to mock me. But after those guys turned into corpses in the smelly pond, no one dared to question my taste in clothing. Sulu listened silently. This was a very common, very conventional story of joy and sorrow. There was no need for any psychological analysis of childhood trauma. But when this underworld boss slowly told it from his own mouth, it was still somewhat shocking. I know that the Empire's household registration system is very strict. Although there are indeed many fugitives hiding in the slums, why did you escape from your hometown to here? Sulu asked. Because I killed the young master who jumped and screamed like a girl for a fur coat. A very coherent sentence came out of this underworld boss's mouth without any hesitation. As a listener, Sulu couldn't help but stare blankly for a long time. Muwen told the story to his heart's content. Licking his lips, he took out 2 sticks of coarse tobacco and passed one to him. Silently taking the coarse tobacco and lighting it, Sulu greedily took a deep breath. Squinting his eyes, he looked at the Empire's capital city under the setting sun. He remembered that when he was young, he had also violently killed people. The red and warm light of the star gradually sank below the towering palace wall, and the busy aircraft taking off and landing in the northern sky gradually decreased in frequency. Finally, the night wind blew over from Feng Lake in the south, passing through the rugged and narrow streets of the slums with great difficulty, bringing a little coolness and blowing away some of the suffocating pain of the summer heat. Sulu and Muwen held the coarse tobacco between their fingers and silently sat on the second floor. Looking at this scene, they exhaled the expensive smoke. Make the preparations. The spaceship prepared for you will arrive in 3 days. I will tell you the address then. Mu-En looked ahead and slowly said, "We only have the ability to send you out of the Tianjing star system and enter the pirate route. As for whether that spaceship can pass through the heavy military blockade, it will depend on your ability or luck." Sulu lowered his head and took a deep puff of the cigarette. The spicy smoke entered his lungs and instantly refreshed his spirit. He had been captured, escaped, imprisoned, and escaped again. He had stayed on this planet for nearly a year. Now that he finally had a chance to leave, he couldn't help but be moved. As for Muan's warning, it was also within his expectations. Under the pressure of the Empire's royal family and that highness wrath, the entire underground smuggling and shipping system of Tianjing Star had been cleansed and attacked like never before. The resistance organization, or rather the underworld boss beside him, was actually able to find a spaceship that could leave Tianjing Star. The strength they displayed was already rather impressive. Sorry for the trouble. Helping him return to the Federation was an agreement and a deal. It wasn't helping him because he saw injustice. Thus, Sulu didn't say thank you and only said these 3 words. "We originally promised to send you to your people. That's the real trouble." Muen waved the cigarette in his hand and calmly said, "Our people are on the entire route, but the front lines are at war. No one knows how tight the space control is. If we reach the end, give me a spaceship," Sulu said after a moment of silence. "That's not a problem." Muen suddenly turned his head, stared into his eyes, and said, "But I have to remind you of something. I'm grateful to you for killing Keaton, but it doesn't mean that we are willing to cooperate with the Federation. In order to send you out, many of us will die, so, don't forget what you promised us." Sulu understood the psychological struggle of these underground resistance members very well, so he didn't say anything. At this time, any word he said would mean that the Federation government promised him any help. In fact, it wouldn't make these people feel any better. He narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. 3 of his fingers pinched the thick, round, dark tobacco stick that was about to burn out. He didn't throw it into the pond downstairs like Muan did, but rather carefully and slowly ground it on the floor by his feet. At this moment, an electric bell hidden somewhere on the railing rang softly. Muan quickly got up and walked into the dark corridor. Half a minute later, he pushed a wheelchair to Su Li's side with an unusually respectful expression. Sitting on the wheelchair was the leader of the underground resistance, whose face was full of age spots. He looked somewhat ferocious and terrifying, but his expression was incomparably gentle. Sulu stood up and nodded in greeting. Mr. Voss looked at Sulu with a smile and said, "I have a person I want to introduce to you. In the future, if I'm not here, he will be in charge of contacting you and supervising the implementation of the agreement." A 30-year-old Empire man with a cold expression stood out from the shadow behind the wheelchair. When he saw Sulu, he narrowed his eyes, which were as sharp as knives. After a short pause, he extended his hand and introduced himself, "I'm Chi Dabing. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."